By the 9th century, imperial authority in Japan no longer reached the mountains. The early formation of Japan's warrior class cannot be understood without examining the administrative foundations laid during the Nara, 710 to 794, and early Heian, 794 to 900 periods. During these centuries, Japan's imperial government was modeled on Tang China's centralized bureaucracy, an ambitious experiment known as the Ritsuryo system. Codified in the Taiho, 701, and Yoro, 718 legal codes, the system defined a clear hierarchy of officials, standardized taxation, and prescribed military service for free commoners. Its intent was to bring every province under the emperor's direct authority through uniform administration and recorded population registers. Yet, as records indicate, the effectiveness of this bureaucratic model began to erode within 2 centuries. Geography played a decisive role. Japan's rugged terrain and dispersed agricultural communities made central oversight difficult. Tax collection relied on provincial governors, kakushi, sent from the capital, who often lacked local power and knowledge. In practice, enforcement of imperial edicts weakened as one moved away from the Kinai region, where the court and major temples were concentrated. Archaeological surveys of provincial centers, such as those in Harima and Dazaifu, reveal the uneven distribution of state warehouses and the limited presence of official compounds, evidence of a bureaucracy that failed to penetrate its peripheries. As central control declined, a new form of landholding emerged, the shon, or private estate. Initially granted to temples and aristocrats as tax exemptions, these estates gradually escaped direct imperial oversight. Court families such as the Fujiwara, as well as major Buddhist institutions like Tedaiji and Enryakuji, accumulated extensive landholdings through donation and inheritance. By the mid-9th century, estate managers, zuryo, and local stewards, jido, began asserting semi-autonomous control, collecting rents and enforcing order on behalf of absentee landlords in Kyoto. According to entries in the Shokun Nihon Koki, compiled 840 CE, disputes over estate boundaries and tax exemptions were already common, early indicators of a shift from centralized administration to landed privilege. This transformation carried profound implications for Japan's social hierarchy. The emperor remained a sacred figure, yet practical power was increasingly exercised through hereditary landholding networks. In many regions, local strongmen, often minor aristocrats or former provincial officials, began maintaining small armed contingents to secure their property and suppress banditry. These groups represented the embryonic stage of the warrior class. Unlike later samurai, they were not organized by ideology or a shared code, but by practical necessity, the defense of land and revenue. The presence of mounted warriors in provincial disputes, noted in the Nihon Sandai Jitsuroku, 901 CE, marks one of the earliest textual references to private military retainers operating beyond state control. Several interpretive patterns emerge from this early phase. First, the shift from a conscript army to private armed service illustrates a structural weakness in the Ritsuryo military system. Under Nara law, all adult males owed temporary military duty, but by the 9th century, conscription was both inefficient and unpopular. The court instead relied on provincial militias and eventually authorized local magnates to raise their own troops. This gradual privatization of military power was not an abrupt collapse but an adaptive response to geographic and administrative constraints. Second, the tax-exempt shon system unintentionally created an enduring class of land-based elites whose power derived from autonomy rather than appointment. The future samurai would inherit this pattern, authority grounded in estate management rather than imperial decree. Economic changes reinforced this decentralization. Rice agriculture expanded into new territories, particularly in northern Honshu and Kyushu, as land clearance policies encouraged migration. New irrigation works, confirmed by excavations at sites such as the Asakura district in Fukuoka, reveal local initiative rather than state planning. With agricultural surplus flowing to estate owners instead of the capital, provincial economies became self-sustaining. In effect, Japan's peripheries ceased to function merely as administrative units. They became political arenas in their own right. Culturally, This shift coincided with the Heian court's growing detachment from provincial realities. Kyoto became the locus of refined aristocratic culture, poetry, calligraphy, and elaborate court rituals. But this refinement came at the cost of practical governance. Provincial posts were often sold or assigned as sinecures, with little expectation of direct service. The Enjishiki, 927 CE, a comprehensive administrative manual, already documented numerous exemptions and irregularities in land assessment, confirming that the letter of the law had diverged sharply from actual practice. Interpretively, the Heian court's administrative withdrawal reveals an early Japanese pattern of balancing ideological centralization with local autonomy. The emperor remained the source of legitimacy, but effective power increasingly rested with those who could command loyalty on the ground. This duality, sacred authority versus practical control, would define Japan's political evolution for centuries. The samurai would later institutionalize this balance, governing in the emperor's name while maintaining independent power bases. By the late 9th century, the cumulative effect of these forces, geographic fragmentation, estate autonomy, and the privatization of military function, had reshaped Japan's social order. The central government's fiscal registers grew obsolete, tax revenue declined, and local magnates emerged as de facto rulers of their regions. The Heian capital remained the symbolic heart of civilization, yet its reach was increasingly confined to ritual and diplomacy. Beyond the province's administrative peripheries, a new kind of authority was taking form, one that derived not from imperial decree, but from the ability to protect and enforce. As the capital lost touch with its provinces, military households began to define Japan's future. Out of Japan's provincial conflicts, a new social class emerged, bound by arms, loyalty, and lineage. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Japan's provincial landscape had shifted decisively toward localized control. The erosion of the Ritsuryo bureaucracy left large tracts of land under the supervision of hereditary estate managers, who depended increasingly on armed retainers to protect their holdings. These retainers, known collectively as bushi, literally men of arms, formed the early nucleus of what would later evolve into the samurai class. Their origins were not ideological but practical. They existed to maintain order and enforce claims within a fragmented political economy. The bushi emerged first in frontier and peripheral regions where state presence was weakest. Archaeological surveys in northern Kyushu and the Kanto Plain reveal fortified manor sites, weapon caches, and horse trappings dating from the late Heian period, supporting written accounts of localized militarization. Records from provincial offices, such as the Kokuga of Musashi and Omi, describe repeated disputes over rice paddies, waterways, and taxation. Estate administrators began employing mounted warriors drawn from both local families and former conscripts to patrol borders and deter raiding. In these environments, military ability replaced bureaucratic title as the primary measure of authority. The structure of early bushi organizations reflected Japan's social geography. At the core was the ie, an extended family unit tied by blood and service. These households maintained small groups of dependents, armed followers, and retainers, forming semi-private militias that could be mobilized quickly. Leadership rested with a patriarchal figure who combined land management with military command. The bushi's loyalty to such leaders was personal rather than institutional, rooted in kinship and mutual obligation. This system of reciprocal service would later solidify into the hierarchical Gokunin networks of the Kamakura shogunate, but its essential logic, protection exchanged for service, was already visible by the 10th century. Weaponry and tactics of this early warrior stratum were shaped by Japan's agrarian economy and geography. Excavated arrowheads, lamellar armor fragments, and sword fittings from sites, such as the Kofun at Iwai, and the Taga fortifications indicate that these fighters favored mobility and archery. The mounted archer became the defining image of the early bushi, contrasting with the Chinese-style infantry armies of the previous centuries. Horse-breeding regions like Eastern Honshu provided the material foundation for this military shift. Training in mounted archery, Kyuba no Michi, though not yet codified as an ethos, represented the practical fusion of skill and survival demanded by frontier life. Interpretively, the rise of the Bushi demonstrates a structural transition from bureaucratic service to hereditary militarization. Where the Ritsuryo system depended on temporary officials appointed by the capital, the emerging Bushi derived power from continuous local presence. Authority thus became geographically grounded rather than administratively assigned. This transition foreshadowed Japan's later feudal order, a system in which land, loyalty, and armed force were interdependent. Socially, the Bushi occupied a space between aristocrat and commoner. Many descended from provincial branches of noble families, particularly the Taira, Heishi, and Minamoto, Genji lineages, who had migrated from Kyoto to manage distant estates. Genealogical records such as the Sanpei Bunmyaku trace these clans to imperial or high court ancestry, but by the 10th century, their prestige derived as much from martial success as from lineage. Other Bushi came from local chieftains or successful farmers who rose through military service. The boundaries between noble and common origins blurred as practical ability took precedence over birth. The consolidation of these families into organized warrior lineages was gradual. The Minamoto and Taira exemplify this evolution. The Minamoto, granted their surname by imperial decree to cadet branches of the royal family, established influence across the Kanto region. The Taira, descendants of Emperor Kanmu, extended their reach into western Honshu and Kyushu. By serving as provincial governors or estate managers, both clans accumulated private armies that eclipsed official garrisons. References in the Nihon Kirayaku, compiled c. 1030, note Taira-led suppression of piracy and local revolts, while inscriptions on bronze mirrors and sword guards attest to the wealth and status of these early warrior elites. A second interpretive insight lies in the emergence of military ethics as a form of social legitimacy. Though the term Bushido did not yet exist, early Heian texts and family records contain precedents for later martial ideals. The Kanjaka Monogatari and the Shomanki, c. 940, portray warriors who valued loyalty, bravery, and personal honor, traits that elevated martial service into a moral identity. These narratives, while partly literary, reflect a shift in societal perception. The warrior was no longer merely a tool of enforcement, but a distinct moral type, governed by internal codes of duty and restraint. At the same time, the growing prevalence of violence among provincial families revealed the instability of this order. The mid-10th century Johei Tenjio disturbances, 931 to 941, illustrated how localized military power could challenge the central government. In these conflicts, the court was compelled to rely on Bushi clans to suppress rebellions, reinforcing their indispensability. This pattern, the state's reliance on the very forces that undermined it, became a recurring feature of Japanese governance. It revealed a deeper structural dynamic, the diffusion of coercive power in exchange for stability. Economically, the rise of Bushi networks coincided with increased agricultural productivity and regional trade. Warriors protected irrigation systems, collected rents, and mediated disputes, embedding themselves in the rural economy. Over time, their role as protectors of estate revenue evolved into semi-official authority. Archaeologists studying settlement layers in the Kanto Plain have identified manor compounds combining defensive architecture with granary complexes, a material reflection of this dual role. By the end of the 10th century, the Bushi had become an indispensable component of provincial society. They enforced the rights of absentee landlords while cultivating their own local bases of support. In this dual capacity, agents of aristocratic interests and autonomous leaders, they bridged the gap between capital and countryside. What began as a practical response to administrative weakness was becoming a distinct social institution grounded in heredity, military competence, and mutual obligation. Interpretive insight. This stage in Japanese history demonstrates how decentralized governance can generate stable but autonomous power structures. The Bushi embodied a new synthesis, private force operating within, yet increasingly independent of, the imperial framework. Their existence foreshadowed the creation of a parallel political order, one rooted in military households rather than bureaucratic offices. By the early 11th century, These local militias had transformed Japan's political landscape. The imperial court still issued titles, but real power rested with those who could command loyalty through arms. These local militias would soon become Japan's political masters. As the capital weakened, the provinces became kingdoms in miniature. By the mid-10th century, the bushi no longer served merely as retainers or guards of noble estates. Across the archipelago, military families began transforming localized power into something approaching sovereignty. What had started as a network of armed managers, protecting harvests and enforcing rent, evolved into autonomous regional dominions, ruled by hereditary clans whose loyalty to the imperial capital was increasingly nominal. The Heian court, long the symbolic heart of Japan's political order, had become insulated by ritual and custom. Within Kyoto's palaces, power was monopolized by the Fujiwara regents, who wielded influence through marriage politics rather than administrative oversight. Outside the capital, imperial decree held little weight. Tax exemptions granted to private estates, shon, eroded the fiscal base of the state, leaving provincial governors, kakushi, dependent on local strongmen for enforcement. In this vacuum, the bushi families, once instruments of state power, emerged as its replacements. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period reveals the transition vividly. Excavations in the Kanto Plain and Chugoku region have uncovered fortified manor sites surrounded by moats and earthen ramparts, clear symbols of semi-independent rule. Documents such as the Enjishiki, compiled 927 CE, and later estate records describe the proliferation of hereditary jido, stewards, and shogun, overseers, who exercised military and economic authority with minimal interference from Kyoto. These local elites often claimed descent from ancient noble houses, legitimizing their autonomy through lineage even as they defied central control. Among these rising families, two lineages came to define Japan's military aristocracy: the Taira, Heishi, and Minamoto, Genji clans. Both traced their origins to imperial cadet branches, but by the 10th century, they had evolved into sprawling warrior federations commanding vast provincial networks. The Taira, descending from Emperor Kanmu, established their power primarily in western Honshu and northern Kyushu. Figures like Taira no Masakado exemplified the volatile blend of loyalty and rebellion that characterized the age. In 939 CE, Masakado led one of Japan's first large-scale insurrections, declaring himself new emperor, Shino. Though swiftly crushed, his uprising marked a watershed moment. It demonstrated that the imperial name no longer guaranteed control, and that provincial warriors could challenge Kyoto's authority directly. The Minamoto or Genji wielded their strength in the east. Their base in the Kanto region, distant from the court but rich in horse breeding and agriculture, gave them strategic depth. Early leaders such as Minamoto no Tsunemoto and Minamoto no Yorimitsu served as imperial enforcers, suppressing banditry and piracy along Japan's coasts. Yet each campaign deepened their independence, as victories brought new lands, followers, and prestige. The court's dependence on these warrior families blurred the boundary between service and autonomy. The enforcers of imperial will were becoming lords in their own right. This transformation was not merely political but socio-economic. The administration of the Shon system gradually became militarized. Wealthy aristocrats in Kyoto, unable to personally supervise their distant holdings, delegated authority to hereditary stewards who combined land management with coercive power. The steward's right to collect taxes, settle disputes, and maintain order effectively turned them into provincial governors. Over time, these roles became dynastic, passing from father to son. Loyalty to the estate's nominal owner, a court noble or temple, gave way to loyalty to the clan. In this context, the bushi ethos deepened into a class identity. Service to a lord was increasingly measured not by ceremonial rank but by martial achievement and hereditary association. The distinction between imperial official and warrior retainer faded, replaced by webs of personal allegiance that cut across bureaucratic lines. The i.e. household, with its retainers, vassals, and dependents, became the fundamental unit of governance. Scholars often describe this process as the privatization of power. The Heian state did not collapse abruptly. Rather, it was hollowed out from within. Land, labor, and law enforcement, the pillars of government, passed into private hands. By the 11th century, Kyoto's decrees required local cooperation to be effective, and provincial disputes were resolved through arms more often than litigation. This was not anarchy but decentralization, a mosaic of semi-sovereign households whose authority rested on inheritance and military strength. Culturally, this shift gave rise to a new moral vocabulary of loyalty and legitimacy. Stories such as the Shomonki and Kanjaku Monogatari circulated tales of valor and betrayal, framing the warrior not as a servant of the state but as the hero of his own domain. The ideals of courage, loyalty, and duty giri began to crystallize into recognizable virtues. Though Bushido as a formal philosophy would not be articulated for centuries, its ethical roots were already spreading through these clan traditions. The consequences were profound. The imperial court, dependent on warrior families to suppress revolts, inadvertently legitimized their autonomy. When rebellions flared, the Minamoto or Taira were summoned to restore order, and each victory expanded their lands and reputation. The sword, once the tool of service, became the emblem of sovereignty. By the late Heian period, the question was no longer whether warriors could rule, but which clan would rule first. By the turn of the 11th century, Japan had entered what historians call the Age of the Provincial Lords. The Taira and Minamoto stood at the apex of this new social order, vast military households commanding retainers across the islands, functioning as de facto regional governments. Their rivalries, alliances, and family intrigues would soon erupt into open conflict, setting the stage for Japan's first great age of civil war. The 10th century represents the inflection point between state-centered administration and feudal autonomy. As imperial governance withered, authority flowed outward to the periphery. The Minamoto and Taira did not overthrow the old order. They inherited it weaponized and hereditary. This fragmentation would soon ignite Japan's first great age of civil war. Japan's first true civil war ended with a boy emperor and a new form of rule. By the late 12th century, the political order established during the Heian period had collapsed into armed contest. The imperial court, once the uncontested center of Japanese governance, had become a stage upon which powerful military clans competed for legitimacy. At the heart of this struggle stood two families, the Taira, Heika, and the Minamoto Genji, whose rivalry would define the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, a conflict that marked the end of aristocratic supremacy and the birth of Japan's first military government. The origins of the conflict lay in the aftermath of Taira no Kayamori's unprecedented rise to power. Having triumphed over rival warrior families during the Heiji disturbance of 1159, Kayamori secured control of the court through political acumen rather than battlefield conquest. He married his daughter into the imperial family, installed his grandson as emperor and toku, and filled high offices with his relatives. This combination of aristocratic privilege and military dominance represented a structural innovation. For the first time, a provincial warrior clan ruled from Kyoto itself. Yet this achievement proved fragile. The Taira's concentration of power alienated both the old nobility and rival warriors. By the 1170s, widespread resentment brewed in the provinces and among displaced Minamoto survivors. In 1180 CE, open rebellion began. Prince Machihito, a member of the imperial line hostile to Taira dominance, issued a call to arms, recorded in later chronicles such as the Heika Monogatari, urging Minamoto warriors across the provinces to rise in his name. Though Machihito himself was soon captured and executed, his declaration ignited widespread uprisings. Minamoto no Yoritomo, then in exile in Aizu province, seized the moment. Declaring his allegiance to the emperor but claiming authority to restore peace, Yoritomo established his own base of power in the Kanto region, far from the capital's reach. This decision would prove foundational. By ruling from Kamakura rather than Kyoto, Yoritomo symbolically and administratively shifted Japan's center of power eastward. The early campaigns of the war reflected the geographic and political fragmentation of Japan. Battles erupted across multiple provinces, often fought by semi-autonomous local forces whose loyalties were determined as much by kinship and land rights as by ideology. The Battle of Uji, 1180, one of the first major engagements, demonstrated the growing professionalization of the warrior class. At the Uji Bridge south of Kyoto, Taira troops clashed with Minamoto partisans defending the approaches to the capital. Chronicles describe how warriors cut the bridge planks to halt pursuit, an image that became emblematic of the era's desperate valor. Yoritomo's strategy differed from his predecessors. Rather than marching immediately on Kyoto, he consolidated the eastern provinces, securing a logistical base and forming a network of vassal retainers, gokunin. These men, bound by personal oaths and rewarded with land rights, constituted the structural nucleus of what would become the Kamakura shogunate. While Yoritomo fortified his position, his relatives and allies carried the war westward. Minamoto no Yashinaka, operating from Shinano, briefly captured Kyoto in 1183, but alienated both the court and his kinsmen through undisciplined conduct. His defeat by Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's half-brother, restored the family's reputation and positioned Yoshitsune as the war's most celebrated commander. The decisive phase of the conflict unfolded along Japan's western seaboard, as the Minamoto forces pressed the retreating Taira through a series of engagements. The Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, 1184, broke the Taira defensive perimeter near modern Kobe. Contemporary accounts emphasize the steep cliffs that hemmed in the Taira camp. Minamoto forces descended from the mountains in a surprise assault, scattering their opponents toward the sea. The victory revealed both the tactical flexibility of the new warrior elite and the vulnerability of the Taira, whose power relied heavily on control of maritime routes and coastal estates. The war culminated in the Battle of Dano-Ura, 1185, fought in the narrow straits of the Shimonoseki Channel. Here, the Taira sought to protect the child emperor Entoku, their dynastic symbol. The engagement was among the first in Japanese history to hinge on naval maneuver and tide control. Contemporary chronicles recount how shifting currents turned the tide, literally and strategically, against the Taira. When defeat became inevitable, many of the clan's leaders, including the Empress Dowager and the young emperor, drowned themselves rather than be captured. Archaeological findings of Taira weapons and armor recovered from the straits corroborate these accounts, illustrating the scale of the destruction. The fall of the Taira marked more than the end of a family. It symbolized the demise of the court-centered order that had governed Japan for centuries. Yoritomo emerged as the unchallenged leader of the warrior class, yet his position required careful negotiation. Rather than overthrowing the imperial institution, he sought imperial sanction. In 1192, Emperor Go-Toba formally appointed Yoritomo as Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, a title historically reserved for frontier commanders, but now imbued with new meaning. Under this arrangement, the emperor retained ceremonial authority, while real power rested with Yoritomo's military government in Kamakura. This dual structure, often described as dual polity, Ryoto Seiji, reflected the pragmatic compromise of the age. The imperial court remained the source of legitimacy, but the bakufu, the shogunal government, controlled military and administrative functions. It was an arrangement born not of theory but of necessity, shaped by a century of decentralization and civil conflict. The Genpei War thus stands as a watershed in Japanese history. It unified the provincial warrior networks under a single military regime and institutionalized the separation of symbolic and practical authority that would characterize Japanese governance for centuries. The conflict also produced a lasting cultural legacy. Epic narratives like the Heike Monogatari, composed in the 13th century, preserved the war's memory in literary form, portraying its events as both heroic and tragic. A meditation on impermanence, mujo, a concept that would resonate deeply in Japanese thought. From a systemic perspective, the war's significance lay not only in who won but in how power was reorganized. The Minamoto victory formalized the military class's ascendancy, turning regional autonomy into an administrative system. Through networks of gokunin and stewards, Jito, Kamakura established direct relationships with landholders, bypassing the Kyoto bureaucracy. The provincial warrior had become a state official. The decentralized reality of the preceding centuries was finally codified into law. By the end of the 12th century, Japan had transitioned from an aristocratic to a military polity. The court still crowned emperors and performed rituals, but the shogun ruled in practice. The Genpei War had transformed private warfare into public authority, a transformation whose consequences would define the medieval Japanese state. Victory brought not peace, but the creation of a dual government. For the first time, the sword and the seal ruled side by side. When Minamoto no Yoritomo was formally appointed Sei Taishogun in 1192, Japan entered a new political order. The Kamakura Bakufu, headquartered far from the ceremonial world of Kyoto, institutionalized the military class as the governing authority. For the first time in Japanese history, rule was divided between two centers of power: the emperor and court nobility in Kyoto, who preserved ancient ritual legitimacy, and the shogunate in Kamakura, which exercised real administrative control. This was not a revolution but an adaptation, the natural culmination of centuries of provincial autonomy and the rise of warrior authority. Yoritomo's genius lay in transforming personal allegiance into formal bureaucracy. From his coastal stronghold in Kamakura, he established a system that regulated land, law, and loyalty across the archipelago. The foundation of this structure was the network of vassals, gokunin, warrior landholders who had supported Yoritomo during the Genpei War. In return for their service, they were confirmed as hereditary possessors of their estates, bound to Kamakura by oaths of fealty rather than imperial appointment. This reciprocal relationship, protection in exchange for loyalty, defined Japan's emerging feudal hierarchy. To administer this vast network, Yoritomo created two new offices that would become defining features of medieval governance: the shogo, military governors, and the jito, estate stewards. The shogo, appointed to each province, were responsible for policing, military mobilization, and suppressing rebellion. The jito, often drawn from local gokunin, managed tax collection and estate defense at the village level. Together, these posts effectively transferred day-to-day control of Japan's provinces to the military government. The imperial bureaucracy technically retained ownership of the land, but enforcement, the ability to compel, now lay entirely with the sword. Documents from this period, such as the Azuma Kagami, compiled by Kamakura officials, record the precision with which Yoritomo delineated authority. Unlike the Taira, who had attempted to dominate the imperial court from within, the Minamoto constructed a parallel administration. Kamakura officials issued orders under the name of the shogun, not the emperor, and corresponded directly with provincial governors. The Bakufu, literally tent government, was thus both symbolic and literal, a government born from the military camp but evolving into a permanent institution. This dual system, court and shogunate, created a delicate balance. Kyoto continued to confer titles, perform enthronements, and maintain cultural prestige. Kamakura, in turn, handled land disputes, military organization, and judicial enforcement. The emperor's moral authority was preserved, while the shogun exercised what historians call de facto sovereignty. Rather than abolishing imperial rule, the Bakufu rendered it ceremonial, leaving the facade intact while transferring practical power to the provinces. Yoritomo's administration also introduced Japan's first formal legal code for the warrior class. The Gozaibai Shikamoku, promulgated in 1232 under his successor Hojo Yasutoki, systematized judicial procedure and codified precedents governing inheritance, vassalage, and land tenure. The code's purpose was pragmatic: to regulate the rights and obligations of gokunin in a world where overlapping claims were common. Its clauses were concise, factual, and steeped in precedent rather than ideology. For instance, disputes over estate division were to be resolved according to documented lineage and service, not rank or court title. In this, the Gozaibai Shikamoku exemplified the warrior ethos, law as an extension of duty, loyalty, and record. Yoritomo's death in 1199 revealed both the strength and fragility of the system he had built. His successors, beginning with his sons Yori and Sanetomo, lacked his authority. Real power shifted to his widow Hojo Masako and her natal clan. Masako, often called the Nun Shogun, presided over the consolidation of Hojo Regency, Shikken, which would dominate the shogunate for the next century. The Hojo did not seize the title of shogun for themselves. Instead, they ruled as regents to figurehead Minamoto successors, or even princes appointed from Kyoto. This arrangement preserved continuity while ensuring Hojo control, embodying the cautious pragmatism that characterized early samurai politics. Under Hojo stewardship, the Council of State, Hyojoshu, became the Bakufu's core governing body. Composed of senior officials and jurists, it adjudicated land disputes and enforced discipline among gokunin. The emphasis on record-keeping and precedent reflected the warrior class's need for stability in a decentralized society. The Bakufu's archives, maintained meticulously in Kamakura, recorded every grant, confirmation, and appeal, a bureaucratic innovation rivaling that of the earlier Heian court, yet oriented toward military administration rather than aristocratic ceremony. The Kamakura regime's success rested on three interlocking principles: personal loyalty, administrative clarity, and mutual benefit. Vassals gained legal recognition and protection of their holdings. The shogunate gained an enforceable network of armed retainers. It was an early form of political federalism, uniting Japan's regions through obligation rather than geography. The system's endurance over a century illustrates its adaptability. It could incorporate Buddhist monasteries, aristocratic estates, and even the imperial family within its patronage structure, provided they acknowledged Kamakura's judicial supremacy. Interpretively, the Kamakura Bakufu represents Japan's institutionalization of decentralization. Rather than re-centralizing power after the Genpei War, Yoritomo codified the existing autonomy of the provinces. In doing so, he transformed Japan's patchwork of estates into a cohesive legal and military hierarchy. The coexistence of court and shogunate, of the seal and the sword, offered stability without abolishing tradition. It was a uniquely Japanese synthesis, continuity through duality. Yet the new order remained vulnerable. Its power derived not from ideology but from mutual necessity. The gokunin owed loyalty because the shogunate guaranteed their rights. The shogunate ruled because it could marshal their arms. As generations passed and the memory of Yoritomo's leadership faded, these bonds weakened. Moreover, the Kamakura regime faced a challenge that no Japanese government had yet confronted: the prospect of invasion from beyond the sea. By the mid-13th century, diplomatic envoys from the newly established Mongol Empire arrived demanding submission. The Bakufu, already managing internal disputes and complex relations with Kyoto, now confronted an existential external threat. How this military government responded would determine not only its survival but the future definition of samurai identity itself. But external threats would soon test the shogunate's legitimacy. The Mongols never conquered Japan, but they nearly broke it. In the late 13th century, Japan faced an unprecedented threat from beyond the seas. The Mongol Empire, having subjugated most of Eurasia, turned its gaze eastward. Under Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of China's Yuan dynasty, the Mongols demanded Japan's submission as a tributary state. For the Kamakura shogunate, now over 80 years old, this was the first encounter with a foreign power capable of challenging its authority. The crisis would expose both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Japan's first military government. The confrontation began with diplomacy. Between 1268 and 1274, Kublai Khan sent a series of envoys to Japan demanding recognition of Yuan supremacy. The Kamakura Bakufu, advised by the Hojo regents, refused to acknowledge these demands. In the ideological framework of the time, Japan viewed itself as an independent realm under divine protection, owing allegiance to no foreign ruler. When the Bakufu executed the final group of Mongol emissaries in 1275, the possibility of negotiation vanished. The first invasion came in 1274, when a combined Mongol-Korean force estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 men landed on the coasts of Kyushu. The invading army brought with it technologies unfamiliar to Japanese defenders: composite bows of great range, iron armor, catapults, and early forms of explosive projectiles recorded in both Japanese chronicles and archaeological finds. The Moko Shurai Ekitoba, an illustrated account created decades later, depicts the shock of battle: organized Mongol infantry formations advancing under volleys of smoke and fire, confronting Japanese warriors who fought individually according to older traditions of personal valor. At Hakata Bay, the Mongol advance met fierce resistance from local samurai under the command of regional shogun. Japanese accounts note the attackers' discipline and coordination, a stark contrast to the single combat ethos of the samurai, who prized individual duels as demonstrations of skill and lineage. The clash of tactics exposed the limits of Japan's decentralized military system. Yet the Mongols, lacking logistical support and unfamiliar with the terrain, withdrew after only a day of major fighting, reportedly hindered by storms during their retreat. The shogunate, recognizing the vulnerability of Japan's coasts, responded with unprecedented mobilization. Defensive walls were constructed along Hakata Bay, watchtowers were erected, and garrisons were maintained year-round. The Bakufu's administrative efficiency was tested as never before. It coordinated supplies, labor, and troop rotations across multiple provinces, revealing its capacity to operate as a national government rather than a mere coalition of vassals. In 1281, Kublai Khan launched a second, far larger invasion. 2 fleets, one from Korea and one from southern China, converged on Kyushu with a combined force of over 100,000 soldiers. The Japanese defenders, now better prepared and supported by fortifications, resisted stubbornly. For several weeks, intense skirmishes raged along the coastline, with samurai conducting nighttime raids against Mongol ships. Then, in midsummer, a massive typhoon struck. Contemporary sources, both Japanese and Chinese, describe how the storm scattered and destroyed much of the invading fleet. The Japanese later called it the kamikaze, or divine wind, believing it had been sent by the gods to protect their islands. While the storms indeed devastated the Mongol fleets, modern studies suggest the Japanese defense had already exhausted the invaders' resources. Archaeological surveys in the Amari Bay and Takashima regions have recovered anchors, helmets, and ship timbers from the wrecks, confirming the scale of the disaster. The Mongol threat was neutralized, but its economic and social repercussions would haunt Japan for decades. Unlike earlier wars, the Mongol invasions produced no new territories or spoils for the samurai. The defenders had fought for the nation rather than a lord, a rare instance of collective defense in medieval Japan. Yet the feudal structure of the Kamakura Bakufu was predicated on reward. Warriors rendered service in exchange for land or titles. Without new lands to distribute, the shogunate could not compensate those who had fought. Many Gokunin returned home impoverished, their resources depleted by years of mobilization. The Bakufu attempted to manage the crisis through commendation grants, symbolic rewards recorded in official registers, but these lacked material value. Discontent spread among the provincial samurai, who had risked their lives for little in return. For the first time, loyalty to Kamakura was questioned not out of rebellion, but disillusionment. The same network of mutual obligation that had built the shogunate now began to fray under economic strain. This fiscal exhaustion coincided with administrative stagnation. The Hojo Regency, entrenched after a century of dominance, had grown increasingly oligarchic. Power was concentrated within a few elite families, while provincial officials bore the burdens of defense and reconstruction. The shogunate's need for revenue led to heavier levies and interference in state administration, alienating both Buddhist monasteries and aristocratic patrons who had previously cooperated with Kamakura's rule. Ideologically, the Mongol invasions also reshaped Japan's perception of itself. The notion of divine protection, the kamikaze, became a potent symbol of national destiny. Chronicles such as the Hachiman Gudokun and later religious texts attributed Japan's survival to the intercession of the war god Hachiman. This belief reinforced a sense of insular exceptionalism, positioning Japan as a sacred realm defended by the gods against foreign conquest. Yet this myth also masked a deeper reality. The invasions had drained the country's resources, militarized its society, and exposed the limitations of the shogunate's capacity to reward its supporters. In systemic terms, the Mongol invasions revealed the limits of feudal reciprocity. The Kamakura Bakufu had succeeded in uniting the samurai under a common cause, but it failed to adapt its patronage model to a war of defense rather than expansion. The absence of material gain disrupted the logic of vassalage. Without new lands to distribute, loyalty could no longer be guaranteed through the traditional mechanisms of reward. The warrior class, once bound by necessity to Kamakura, began to reconsider its allegiance. The military success against the Mongols therefore concealed a political defeat. The shogunate survived, but its foundations weakened. The prestige of the Hojo regents declined as they struggled to maintain both defense and domestic order. Banditry increased in the provinces, tax collection faltered, and the court in Kyoto, long subordinated to Kamakura, began to reassert its symbolic authority. The divine wind that had preserved Japan from conquest could not shield the Bakufu from internal decay. By the early 14th century, the samurai class faced a paradox. They had proven their indispensability to the nation's survival, yet received no commensurate reward. This contradiction between service and compensation, loyalty and neglect, would soon erupt into open rebellion. The next great conflict in Japan's history would not come from foreign shores, but from within. Discontent within the samurai ranks would soon turn inward. The samurai who restored the emperor soon overthrew him. In the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate stood weakened by decades of fiscal exhaustion, political rigidity, and growing unrest among its vassals. The Hojo regents, who had effectively ruled Japan for over a century, faced a fracturing coalition. Their authority had survived the Mongol invasions, but the costs of those wars left the Bakufu without land or wealth to sustain its warrior base. As provincial warriors became increasingly autonomous, the rigid bureaucracy of Kamakura appeared out of step with a society that was now fundamentally militarized. Into this climate of dissatisfaction stepped Emperor Go-Daigo, r. 1318 to 1339, a determined ruler who sought to restore direct imperial governance. The emperor's ambitions, known later as the Kenmu Restoration, aimed to roll back samurai dominance and reassert the ancient authority of the throne. Go-Daigo's plan reflected both Confucian and classical court ideals, a revival of centralized, bureaucratic government under imperial leadership. Yet it emerged in an age when power no longer rested in Kyoto ceremonies but in the swords of the warrior class. In 1331, Go-Daigo launched his first attempt to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate. The rebellion failed, and he was exiled to the remote Oki Islands. But the imperial cause survived, sustained by sympathetic warriors and courtiers who viewed the Hojo as corrupt and illegitimate. Among these was Ashikaga Takauji, a descendant of the prestigious Minamoto line and a general under Kamakura's service. When Go-Daigo escaped exile and renewed his rebellion in 1333, Takauji, sent by the shogunate to suppress it, made a fateful decision. He turned his army against Kamakura. Takauji's defection was decisive. Supported by other disaffected warriors, notably Nita Yashisada, who led the assault on Kamakura itself, the old shogunate collapsed. The city was sacked, and the last of the Hojo line committed mass suicide at the family's temple in Toshoji. For the first time in nearly 150 years, the imperial court once again stood as Japan's sole governing authority. The victory, however, exposed the deep contradictions between courtly ideals and samurai realities. Go-Daigo, returning to Kyoto, inaugurated the Kenmu Restoration, 1333 to 1336, an attempt to reconstruct a centralized imperial regime on Tang and Heian models. He abolished the dual government system, dismissed the offices of Shugo and Jito, and sought to reassign land directly from the throne. The emperor also revived the civil bureaucracy and reinstated aristocratic titles, attempting to reintegrate the samurai into a hierarchy of imperial service rather than feudal tenure. For the warriors who had fought to destroy Kamakura, this was a profound disappointment. They had expected reward and recognition in the form of land rights, not a return to court-dominated administration. Many saw the restoration as a reversal of the military autonomy they had earned through war. Ashikaga Takauji, initially appointed to high office under Go-Daigo, soon found himself alienated by the emperor's reforms and favoritism toward court nobles. In 1335, tensions reached a breaking point. When remnants of the Hojo rose in rebellion in eastern Japan, Takauji took command to suppress them, but afterward refused the emperor's order to relinquish control of the region. Instead, he declared opposition to Go-Daigo, claiming to act in defense of legitimate warrior governance. The conflict escalated rapidly into open war. In 1336, Takauji's forces marched west, clashing with imperial loyalists at the Battle of Minatagawa near modern Kobe. Go-Daigo's chief general, Kusunoki Masashige, was defeated and killed, a loss that became legendary in later centuries as a symbol of tragic loyalty. Takauji entered Kyoto soon after and installed a rival emperor, Komio, inaugurating the northern court, while Go-Daigo fled south to Yoshino, establishing the southern court. Thus began the Nambakucho period, 1336 to 1392, a half-century of divided sovereignty between two imperial lines, each claiming legitimacy. The Ashikaga shogunate, or Muromachi Bakufu, was formally established in 1338, when Takauji received the title of Sei-tai shogun. Unlike the Kamakura regime, the new shogunate was based in Kyoto, near the imperial court. This proximity symbolized Takauji's pragmatic approach. He sought to govern through balance rather than outright domination. The Ashikaga did not abolish the emperor's institution, but subordinated it within a dual system of authority. The Bakufu controlled military and administrative matters, while the court retained ceremonial legitimacy. This arrangement reflected Takauji's understanding of Japan's fractured political landscape, a realm where no single institution could rule alone. Yet the Muromachi order began in weakness. The division between North and South courts fragmented the country along both political and familial lines. Many provincial lords declared for one side or the other depending on opportunity. The shogunate's authority was nominal across large areas, particularly in Kyushu and the western provinces. Even among the Ashikaga's allies, loyalty was conditional and contingent on reward. The Ashikaga shoguns attempted to stabilize their rule through land redistribution and alliances with powerful regional families, institutionalizing the Shogo daimyo system. Military governors, originally appointed as representatives of the Bakufu, now held both administrative and territorial power in their provinces. This created a paradox. The very officials meant to enforce the shogunate's authority became semi-autonomous warlords, wielding armies and resources that increasingly rivaled Kyoto itself. Despite these challenges, Ashikaga Takauji and his successors achieved a measure of stability. They reinstated networks of patronage, promoted trade with China, and supported the flourishing of Zen Buddhism, which became culturally dominant among the samurai elite. But the foundations of their rule remained precarious, dependent on personal loyalty, shifting alliances, and the illusion of imperial unity. By the end of the 14th century, the southern court's resistance had faded, and the two imperial lines were formally reconciled in 1392 under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, Takauji's grandson. The reunification ended the Nambakucho era, but the deeper fragmentation it had unleashed persisted. The provincial daimyo had tasted autonomy, and the Ashikaga's victory came less from consolidation than from accommodation. The fall of Kamakura had marked the end of one form of warrior government, hierarchical, centralized, and rigid. The rise of the Ashikaga introduced another, diffuse, negotiated, and vulnerable to centrifugal forces. The emperor had been restored, then overthrown. The samurai had triumphed, yet found themselves divided. Japan's political landscape had entered a new equilibrium, one destined to collapse again under the weight of competing loyalties. The result was a century of competing loyalties. Between fire and ink, the samurai discovered refinement. When Ashikaga Takauji established his shogunate in Kyoto in the 1330s, he created more than a new regime. He initiated an era in which military and artistic culture intertwined. The Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, named after the district in Kyoto that housed the shogun's headquarters, was characterized by a delicate balance between violence and creativity. It was an age when political authority was uncertain, but cultural innovation flourished, producing many of the forms later regarded as quintessentially Japanese. At the beginning of this era, the Ashikaga shogunate remained institutionally fragile. The Bakufu lacked the military dominance of Kamakura and depended heavily on alliances with Shugo daimyo, provincial military governors who wielded considerable independence. The Shugo were expected to collect taxes, maintain order, and mobilize troops when required, yet by the mid-15th century, many had converted their administrative positions into hereditary territorial domains. Thus, even as Kyoto revived as a seat of government, the country's real power continued to drift outward. The Ashikaga shoguns attempted to stabilize this fragmentation through courtly diplomacy and patronage. Unlike their Kamakura predecessors, they operated in close proximity to the imperial court, Buddhist monasteries, and major temples such as Enryakuji on Mount Hai. The shogunate drew legitimacy not through conquest but through ritual and culture. This convergence of sword and brush fostered a distinctive aesthetic ideal among the warrior elite. Discipline, simplicity, and restraint, principles drawn from Zen Buddhism. Zen's influence on Muromachi society was profound. Introduced from China during the late Kamakura period, Rinzai Zen found powerful patrons among the Ashikaga and their retainers. Monasteries such as Tenryuji and Shikokuji became both spiritual centers and administrative institutions, mediating between court and samurai. Zen monks served as envoys, diplomats, and chroniclers, facilitating Japan's tribute trade with Ming China. Their exposure to continental art, ceramics, and calligraphy infused Japanese culture with new refinement. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals how Zen monasteries functioned as hubs of education and artistic production. Records from Shikokuji and Nanzenji describe workshops where monks and lay artisans collaborated on painting, architecture, and garden design. The ink landscape paintings, suibokuga, of artists such as Sesshu Toyo exemplify this synthesis, depicting mountains, rivers, and mists in monochrome, evoking both nature's impermanence and the contemplative ideals of Zen. Under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, r. 1368 to 1394, the third shogun, the Muromachi order reached its cultural zenith. Yoshimitsu unified the northern and southern courts in 1392, temporarily restoring a measure of political coherence. His court became a cosmopolitan center where aristocrats, monks, and samurai mingled. Yoshimitsu sponsored trade missions to China, securing official recognition from the Ming Emperor and importing luxury goods such as silk, lacquer, and ceramics. This diplomacy was not merely economic but ideological. It signaled the shogun's claim to both domestic and international legitimacy. Yoshimitsu's reign also witnessed the emergence of new art forms that would define Japanese cultural identity for centuries. The No theater, refined by Kanami and his son Zimi Motokiyo, combined aristocratic poetics with the minimalist aesthetics of Zen. Performed before elite audiences, No emphasized restraint, symbolism, and the disciplined control of gesture, qualities resonant with samurai ideals of composure and detachment. The plays often drew on themes of loyalty, impermanence, and the spirits of the fallen, mirroring the moral ambiguities of a society built on warfare. Alongside No, the tea ceremony, shinoyu, began its evolution from a simple act of hospitality into a codified ritual of spiritual focus. Initially influenced by Chinese tea culture and the display of imported wares, it gradually absorbed Zen principles of austerity and mindfulness. The act of preparing and sharing tea became a form of meditation on harmony and transience. By the later 15th century, masters such as Murata Juko had laid the conceptual foundations for what would later become the way of tea, Sado, a reflection of samurai discipline in domestic form. architecture and garden design of the Muromachi period further embodied this aesthetic synthesis. The Kinkaku-ji, Golden Pavilion, constructed by Yoshimitsu in 1397, blended aristocratic opulence with the natural harmony of its setting. Its reflection in the surrounding pond symbolized the unity of material and spiritual beauty. The later Ginkaku-ji, Silver Pavilion, initiated by Ashikaga Yoshimasa r. 1449 to 1473, took this sensibility toward abstraction. Its sand gardens and spare design representing the ideal of wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection and impermanence. These cultural achievements, however, masked deepening political decay. The shogunate's reliance on diplomacy and aesthetics could not compensate for its inability to maintain military order. The Shogo daimyo became increasingly autonomous, and rivalries among them often erupted into open conflict. The Bakufu's court-centered administration proved ill-equipped to control distant provinces where land, not ceremony, determined loyalty. The Ashikaga Yoshimitsu period was followed by the reign of Yoshimochi and later Yoshinori, whose assassinations and power struggles weakened the shogunate's legitimacy. Yoshinori's attempt to reassert direct control over the daimyo through coercion and confiscation led to rebellion. Records from the Taihiki and Temple Chronicles detail repeated uprisings, including the Aikyo Rebellion, 1438 to 1439, which revealed the growing defiance of regional lords. Meanwhile, Kyoto itself, the symbolic heart of refinement, became a battlefield. Rival temples, aristocratic factions, and warrior families vied for control of the city's wards. Monasteries such as Enryaku-ji maintained private armies of warrior monks, Sohei, frequently engaging in armed conflict with secular authorities. This intersection of sacred and military violence further eroded centralized power. By the mid-15th century, under Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the Muromachi regime had become politically hollow. Yoshimasa was a notable patron of the arts. He supported painting, and the refinement of tea culture. But his disinterest in administration allowed rival factions to consolidate military strength. The shogunate's inability to mediate disputes among the shogo culminated in the Unin War, 1467 to 1477, a decade-long civil conflict that reduced Kyoto to ruins. Chroniclers record entire districts burned, temples looted, and nobles displaced, marking the symbolic end of the Muromachi order's stability. From an analytical perspective, the Muromachi period represents a paradox of Japanese history: cultural sophistication amid political disintegration. The Ashikaga shogunate could not govern effectively through coercion, so it governed through culture, elevating the arts as a unifying ideology for a fractured elite. Zen aesthetics provided a moral vocabulary of restraint and composure that allowed warriors to find meaning beyond warfare. Yet, the same introspective sensibility that produced lasting artistic forms also reflected a withdrawal from the realities of governance. Archaeological findings from Kyoto's excavation sites, layers of ash, burned timbers, and ceramic fragments, testify to the city's repeated destruction during this period. Side by side with these traces lie the remains of garden ponds and temple foundations, physical evidence of an age where beauty persisted amid instability. The Muromachi order, in its contradictions, encapsulated Japan's recurring historical cycle, the pursuit of harmony against a background of disorder. But refinement could not hold back the tide of war. Kyoto burned for 10 years, and Japan began to burn with it. By the mid-15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate stood as a hollow institution. Its authority, once balanced delicately between imperial court and provincial lords, had eroded under the weight of factional rivalry and administrative weakness. The Unin War, 1467 to 1477, was not merely a struggle over succession or territory. It was the visible fracture of Japan's medieval order. In its flames, the institutions that had governed the country for 2 centuries, imperial, military, and religious alike, disintegrated, giving rise to a new landscape dominated by autonomous regional warlords. The immediate origins of the war lay within the succession dispute of the Ashikaga family. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, having no heir, initially adopted his brother, Yoshimi, to secure the lineage. However, the later birth of Yoshimasa's son, Yoshihisa, in 1465 created a conflict between rival claimants. This dynastic uncertainty became entangled with the ambitions of two powerful shogun daimyo, Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Suzun. Each sought to control the shogunal succession and thus the levers of influence within Kyoto. What began as a political contest soon evolved into an all-consuming civil war. Both Hosokawa and Yamana summoned armies from their provincial bases, filling the capital with tens of thousands of soldiers. Contemporary chronicles such as the Uninki describe a city transformed into a battlefield, where temples, mansions, and markets became fortresses. In early 1467, open fighting erupted in Kyoto streets, and by summer the conflict had engulfed the entire metropolis. The war's prolonged stalemate revealed the depth of Japan's fragmentation. Neither side possessed the capacity to destroy the other, yet neither could withdraw without loss of prestige. The imperial court, reduced to impotence, could only watch as the city was consumed by fire. The shogun himself, unable to assert control, retreated into isolation. Yoshimasa's palace, later rebuilt as the Ginkakuji, Silver Pavilion, became a symbol of the shogunate's retreat from governance into art, aesthetic refinement amid political ruin. Archaeological evidence from Kyoto corroborates the chronicles. Layers of ash and charred debris, dating to the late 15th century, mark the destruction of entire districts. The Higashiyama and Nishijin quarters, once thriving centers of trade and culture, were reduced to wasteland. The city's population scattered, and key temples such as Shikokuji and Nanzenji were severely damaged. The capital, long the heart of Japan's political and cultural life, effectively ceased to function as a governing center. Beyond Kyoto, the effects were even more transformative. The war undermined the authority of the shogun military governors who had previously linked the provinces to the central government. Many of these governors were killed, displaced, or supplanted by their subordinates. In their place emerged a new class of local military rulers known as daimyo, men who derived power not from appointment but from direct control of land and armed retainers. This process, later termed Gekukujo, the low overcoming the high, defined the transition from the Muromachi to the Sengoku period, circa 1467 to 1600, the age of warring states. The Sengoku transformation was not an organized revolution but a gradual collapse of hierarchy. As Kyoto's influence waned, provincial leaders consolidated autonomous domains. These new daimyo often came from lesser samurai families, temple estates, or even peasant militias. Their legitimacy rested on their ability to govern effectively and maintain order within their territories. This pragmatic form of rule, based on military strength and administrative competence, marked a decisive departure from the hereditary aristocracy of earlier centuries. The Unin War's disintegration of authority also had significant economic consequences. With the decline of centralized taxation and oversight, local lords began to manage production and trade within their regions. Excavations in former castle towns such as Kofu and Odawara reveal rapid urbanization during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as fortified settlements became centers of commerce and administration. Merchants and artisans, previously dependent on court and temple patronage, now aligned with regional powers who provided protection in exchange for resources. Religious institutions, too, adapted to the new order. Major Buddhist sects such as the Ikkoshu, True Pure Land, established fortified temple communities, Ikki, particularly in the Kinai and Hokuriku regions. These leagues of monks, farmers, and townspeople resisted samurai domination, forming semi-independent polities governed by religious councils. The most notable of these, the Ikoiki of Kaga Province, maintained self-rule for nearly a century. Their defiance of both daimyo and shogun exemplified the broader decentralization of authority. The Ashikaga shogunate nominally survived the Unin War, but only as a shadow of its former self. Shogun Yoshimasa abdicated in favor of his son, Yoshihisa, in 1473, but real power had already passed to the provincial lords. The bakufu's administrative offices in Kyoto fell into disuse, and the court relied on ad hoc diplomacy with regional leaders. The emperor, deprived of both revenue and enforcement, played a ceremonial role at best. By 1477, both Hosokawa and Yamana were dead, and their exhausted armies withdrew from Kyoto. Yet no side claimed victory, for nothing remained to govern. The capital was a ruin, and the authority it once symbolized was gone. Chroniclers described the aftermath as a country without master, Mun no Kuni, a phrase capturing the political vacuum that defined the next century. In this fragmented landscape, regional consolidation accelerated. The former Shogo families evolved into autonomous houses, the Takeda in Kai, Usuji in Ekigo, Mori in Chugoku, Oda in Owari, and Shimazu in Kyushu, each governing its territory as a de facto state. They built castles, issued their own laws, and maintained standing armies of professional retainers. Warfare became continuous but increasingly structured, governed by evolving codes of discipline and strategy. The Sengoku era that followed the Unin War was thus both chaotic and generative. It produced a new political ecology in which legitimacy was earned through competence rather than inherited from Kyoto. The daimyo maintained cadastral surveys, standardized taxation, and agricultural reforms, laying the groundwork for the early modern state that would later emerge under Tokugawa rule. In this sense, the collapse of the Muromachi order was not simply a descent into anarchy but a redistribution of governance across hundreds of semi-independent domains. From an analytical perspective, the Unin War represents a classic case of systemic failure. A central regime unable to mediate elite competition, leading to the reorganization of power at lower levels. The conflict demonstrated how Japan's medieval institutions, based on personal loyalty and hereditary office, were ill-suited to a society now defined by mobility, commerce, and local militarization. The daimyo state was an adaptive response to that vacuum, blending military control with pragmatic administration. Archaeological and textual sources together reinforce this picture. Excavations at late 15th century castle sites such as Ikejidani and Ekizen have uncovered planned urban layouts, merchant quarters, and storage facilities, evidence of sophisticated governance, even amid political disunity. Meanwhile, contemporary chronicles describe shifting alliances and constant warfare, yet also record the emergence of order within regional domains. By the end of the 15th century, Japan was no longer a unified polity but a constellation of rival powers, each striving to impose stability within its borders. The Ashikaga shogunate, once the mediator between court and province, had become irrelevant. The era that followed would be defined by ambition, by the rise of men who sought to reunify the country through strength, strategy, and vision. From its ashes, a new generation of warlords would rise. Loyalty was now measured in land, not lineage. The Japan that emerged from the ashes of the Unin War was no longer governed by the decrees of Kyoto. The emperor remained a symbol, the shogun a shadow. Power had migrated outward into the valleys, plains, and fortress towns of the provinces, where men of ambition and skill carved their own realms from the wreckage of the old order. These men were the daimyo, the great lords of the Sengoku age, whose strength no longer derived from hereditary office but from direct command of territory, soldiers, and surplus. In the vacuum left by the Ashikaga collapse, the daimyo created new systems of rule rooted in pragmatism rather than pedigree. Their legitimacy came from the ability to protect their land and people, to collect taxes efficiently, and to maintain armies that could defend or expand their borders. This marked a profound reorganization of Japanese society, a transition from a court-centered hierarchy to a network of regional states, each functioning as a self-contained polity. Archaeology and surviving documents from the late 15th century illustrate this transformation vividly. Across Japan, fortified hilltops and river valleys sprouted castles, not the towering white citadels of later centuries, but rough yamajiro, mountain fortresses constructed of earthworks and timber. Excavations at sites like Kasagayama, home of the Usuji, Odani, of the Azai, and Ikejidani, of the Asakura, reveal layered defenses, storage pits, and planned compounds designed for both governance and survival. These fortresses became administrative capitals, anchoring emerging local economies and symbolizing the lord's authority. Within these strongholds, the samurai's role evolved. Once retainers of aristocratic patrons or provincial governors, they now became salaried vassals of the daimyo, bound not by inherited loyalty but by contracts, explicit pledges of service in exchange for stipends or land allotments. These agreements, recorded in documents known as Chijiojo and Kendaka, define the obligations of military service, tax collection, and local governance. Samurai who failed to perform could be dispossessed. Conversely, those who distinguished themselves in battle could rise swiftly through the ranks. In this sense, the Sengoku period democratized the military elite. Merit replaced ancestry as the coin of advancement. The military economies of the daimyo were sustained by agricultural innovation and local administration. Extensive land surveys, such as those conducted by the Takeda in Kai and the Shimizu in Kyushu, allowed lords to measure productivity with unprecedented precision. Villages were categorized by yield, taxes standardized in rice equivalents, koku, and peasant households registered under new cadastral systems. This created a direct fiscal relationship between the peasantry and the ruling house, bypassing the intermediaries who had dominated the Muromachi era. In return for protection and stability, peasants were expected to contribute both labor and arms. Many domains organized peasant militias, a shigeru, foot soldiers drawn from the rural populace, who could be mobilized during campaigns. Unlike the professional mounted samurai of earlier centuries, a shigeru fought with spears, bows, and, increasingly, firearms. Their presence revolutionized warfare, allowing lords with strong agricultural bases to field larger armies than ever before. The scale of conflict expanded, transforming Japan into a patchwork of militarized domains competing for survival. This new militarization was not purely destructive. It also fostered institutional discipline and administrative innovation. Daimyo promulgated house codes, bunkakuho, legal charters governing conduct, taxation, inheritance, and justice within their territories. The Imagawa Kana Mokoroku and the Takeda Shingen Shikamoku are among the best known, reflecting a concern with moral governance, frugality, and public order. Through such codes, the daimyo legitimated their rule not simply by conquest but through law and order, establishing a framework for civil society even amid continuous war. The social structure of Sengoku Japan hardened around this military administrative logic. At the top stood the daimyo and their hereditary vassals. Beneath them, the samurai bureaucracy, scribes, magistrates, and castle stewards, who enforced governance. Below lay the farmers, artisans, and merchants whose labor sustained the system. Yet the boundaries between these classes were more fluid than before. Ambitious peasants could rise through martial service, and skilled administrators could achieve high office regardless of birth. This mobility, though limited, represented a significant shift from the rigid hierarchies of the Heian and Kamakura worlds. Economic life adapted to the realities of war. Castle towns, jokamichi, developed around daimyo seats, housing craftsmen, armorers, and merchants who supplied the armies. The growth of local markets, ichi, and regional trade routes created new centers of exchange, linking the hinterlands to the sea. Merchant guilds and shipping families such as the Kawamura and Chaya clans prospered by financing war efforts and provisioning troops. Even piracy, once a scourge, became institutionalized under daimyo sponsorship. The Murakami and Kuki naval families, for example, acted as both traders and maritime enforcers. Religious institutions, too, navigated this turbulent landscape. Many Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines forged alliances with daimyo, receiving protection in exchange for spiritual legitimacy. Others, like the militant Ikoiki, remained fiercely independent, establishing theocratic fortresses such as Ishiyama Honganji that rivaled the power of samurai lords. The interplay between sword and scripture, between temporal and spiritual authority, became one of the era's defining dynamics. Politically, the daimyo were pragmatic statesmen as much as warriors. They negotiated alliances through marriage, adopted hostage diplomacy, and relied on intricate systems of reciprocal obligation to manage their vassal networks. Yet the instability of the time meant that trust was fragile and betrayal common. Chroniclers record countless examples of shifting allegiances, coups, and assassinations, a world where survival demanded both cunning and ruthlessness. And yet, within this turbulence, patterns of proto-national integration began to appear. The strongest daimyo sought to extend their control beyond their home provinces, uniting regions under cohesive administration. The Takeda in central Japan built extensive road systems. The Mori in the west developed powerful navies. The Hojo of the Kanto established a network of fortifications and codified governance. Each became a model of regional statecraft, small, efficient, militarized polities that would later form the building blocks of a unified Japan. By the mid-16th century, this competitive equilibrium had produced a new political map. Roughly 60 major daimyo domains dominated the archipelago, separated by shifting alliances and fluid borders. Warfare was constant but rarely aimless. It functioned as a mechanism of selection, refining military technique and governance alike. Victory favored not only strength but also organization, and the most successful lords were those who mastered both. Among these, certain figures began to rise above the rest, men whose ambition reached beyond provincial rule toward national unification. In Owari, a volatile province near the heart of the archipelago, a minor lord named Oda Nobunaga would soon seize power with unprecedented audacity. His conquests would mark the beginning of a new epoch, one in which the dream of unity, long buried beneath centuries of civil war, would burn once more. And one man would begin to reunite them. Gunpowder and iron discipline forged the first modern Japan. By the mid-16th century, Japan had endured nearly a century of ceaseless warfare. Provinces had become miniature kingdoms, each ruled by its own daimyo. Power was local, alliances fleeting, and the imperial court reduced to ceremonial impotence. Amid this fragmentation, a new kind of leader emerged, pragmatic, ruthless, and unburdened by the conventions of feudal loyalty. That leader was Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582, Lord of Owari, whose vision of order through domination marked the beginning of Japan's transformation from medieval anarchy to early modern statehood. Nobunaga's rise was as improbable as it was meteoric. The Oda clan had long been divided between rival branches, each holding small tracts of land along the Takeda Road. Nobunaga, the son of a minor lord, inherited little more than a precarious foothold in a region beset by stronger neighbors. Yet, through a series of calculated campaigns beginning in the 1550s, he consolidated Owari under his rule. His victory at the Battle of Okahazama, 1560, over Imagawa Yoshimoto, a vastly superior force, became the turning point. Contemporary chronicles such as the Shinsho Koki describe his lightning assault on the Imagawa encampment as an act of both audacity and tactical genius. This triumph gave Nobunaga legitimacy among the fractured samurai elite and marked the first demonstration of his distinctive warfare: speed, discipline, and total control. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Nobunaga understood that the wars of the Sengoku period could not be won by valor alone. The age of individual heroism was yielding to an era of logistics, coordination, and firepower. He reorganized his armies into professional units trained for collective maneuver rather than single combat. The introduction of arquebus, matchlock firearms first brought by Portuguese traders in 1543, revolutionized his tactics. Nobunaga not only adopted these weapons but mass-produced and standardized them, supplying his troops through centralized arsenals and merchant contracts in the port city of Sakai. His use of firearms reached its defining moment at the Battle of Nagashino, 1575, fought against the formidable cavalry of the Takeda clan. Nobunaga's army deployed nearly 3,000 gunners behind wooden palisades, rotating volleys to maintain constant fire. According to Jesuit observer Luis Frois, the resulting barrage shattered the Takeda charge and signaled the arrival of modern combined arms warfare in Japan. The engagement demonstrated the strategic shift Nobunaga had initiated, away from personal valor toward systemic military organization, a precursor to the disciplined armies of later centuries. Nobunaga's military strength rested upon equally transformative political and economic reforms. He dismantled many of the feudal intermediaries that had long obstructed efficient governance. Taxation, trade, and military service were brought under direct central control. He abolished toll barriers, standardized currency transactions, and declared free markets, rikichirakuza, in the territories he conquered. These decrees allowed merchants to operate without guild monopolies or daimyo interference, encouraging commercial fluidity and urban expansion. Cities like Kyoto, Azuchi, and Sakai flourished as centers of production and trade, linking rural economies to the demands of warfare and administration. Equally significant was his ideological centralization. Nobunaga's rule was not merely an extension of daimyo competition but a redefinition of sovereignty itself. For the first time since the Heian era, a single military leader sought to subordinate all regional lords to a unified hierarchy. His methods were uncompromising. Loyalty was enforced through hostage systems, strategic marriages, and confiscation of lands. He demanded direct service and punished defiance without hesitation. In this, Nobunaga created what historians term the Oda polity, a quasi-centralized domain structured around military bureaucracy, economic regulation, and personal allegiance to the lord rather than to one's hereditary lineage. Yet Nobunaga's revolution extended beyond politics and warfare. It was also ideological, targeting the entrenched powers that had long mediated between heaven and earth. Chief among these were the Buddhist monasteries, particularly the militant sects that had accumulated wealth and autonomy since the Heian period. Nobunaga regarded these religious strongholds as obstacles to unification. His campaigns against the Ikoiki, leagues of militant devotees, were relentless. The Siege of Mount Hai, 1571, remains one of the most infamous episodes of his rule. There, Nobunaga's forces annihilated the Enryakuji Monastery, seat of the Tendai order, killing monks and laypeople alike. The destruction of Mount Hai was not simply an act of cruelty. It was strategic and symbolic. The Tendai monks had historically served as kingmakers and armed brokers in court politics. By eliminating their power, Nobunaga severed the last link between religious and political authority. Similarly, his decade-long suppression of the Ikoiki in Ishiyama Honganji, culminating in 1580, extinguished the last autonomous Buddhist military force. These campaigns marked a decisive secularization of political power, clearing the path for a unified state unencumbered by competing spiritual sovereignties. Nobunaga also manipulated the imperial institution with calculated precision. Recognizing its symbolic value, he maintained the emperor in Kyoto and funded court ceremonies, using imperial recognition to legitimize his conquests. Yet he made clear that the court existed at his discretion. The emperor's authority became ceremonial, while Nobunaga wielded the real instruments of rule, armies, taxation, and law. This dual structure of nominal legitimacy and military control anticipated the later Tokugawa system. Culturally, Nobunaga fostered an environment of aesthetic innovation that mirrored his political transformation. His castle at Azuchi, completed in 1579, exemplified this synthesis of martial power and refined taste. Rising above Lake Biwa, it was both fortress and palace. Its walls adorned with gold leaf and its halls used for diplomatic receptions. Jesuit missionaries recorded their astonishment at its grandeur, describing it as a symbol of Japan's entry into the early modern world. Within its walls, Nobunaga patronized tea ceremonies, no performances, and European technology alike. This convergence of cosmopolitanism and control defined his vision of modernity. Disciplined, ordered, and self-consciously new. Despite his accomplishments, Nobunaga's governance was inherently unstable. His rapid conquests alienated many daimyo, and his authoritarian methods bred resentment among even loyal retainers. The very centralization he pursued depended on personal charisma and military dominance, neither of which could be institutionalized during his lifetime. The fragile coalition he assembled began to fracture under the strain of ambition. In 1582, While campaigning against the Mori in the west, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. At the temple of Honnoji in Kyoto, Nobunaga was attacked by his own men and forced to commit suicide. His death sent shockwaves through the nation. The man who had nearly unified Japan had fallen not to an external enemy but to the volatile politics of loyalty and vengeance that he had exploited so effectively. Yet Nobunaga's legacy endured far beyond his demise. He had fundamentally altered the structure of Japanese governance, replacing feudal fragmentation with centralized administration, elevating commerce and technology as instruments of power, and redefining sovereignty as a matter of pragmatic control rather than hereditary right. His campaigns against the Buddhist orders ended the fusion of temple and state, while his market reforms accelerated Japan's transition toward a monetized economy. The age that followed, the rule of Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would build upon the foundations he laid. Historians often regard Nobunaga as Japan's first modern ruler not because of the technologies he employed, but because of the systemic rationality he imposed upon chaos. His was a revolution of structures, military, administrative, and ideological. In the crucible of constant war, he forged a vision of unity that would survive his own destruction. His death left a vacuum only ambition could fill. From peasant to ruler, Hideyoshi embodied the samurai's paradox. The death of Oda Nobunaga in 1582 left Japan once again without a central authority. In the chaos that followed the Honnoji incident, the question of succession loomed large. Who would inherit the mantle of unification that Nobunaga had nearly completed? The answer came from an unexpected source, a man of humble birth and boundless ambition, whose rise from peasant foot soldier to national ruler remains without precedent in Japanese history. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 to 1598. Hideyoshi's early life embodied the volatility of Sengoku society. Born in Nakamura village, Owari province, he was the son of a peasant foot soldier. Without family lineage or hereditary title, he entered service under Nobunaga as a low-ranking retainer, first managing supplies and construction. His administrative skill, charisma, and tactical acumen soon distinguished him within Nobunaga's retinue. According to the Taikoki, a contemporary chronicle of his life, Hideyoshi's rise was based not on inherited privilege but on merit, adaptability, and cunning, traits essential in an age where power could be seized by those who dared. Following Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi acted with remarkable speed. He confronted the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, 1582, defeating him within days. In the ensuing years, Hideyoshi outmaneuvered rivals for control of Nobunaga's coalition, notably Shibata Katsui and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Through both military skill and shrewd diplomacy, he emerged as the preeminent power by 1585, assuming the title of Kampuku, imperial regent, a position traditionally reserved for court nobles. The emperor's sanction gave Hideyoshi legal legitimacy, while his armies gave him real power. By 1590, with the fall of the Hojo clan at Odawara, Japan was unified for the first time in over a century. Hideyoshi's unification of Japan was not merely a military achievement. It was a systemic reconstruction of social order. The century of warfare had eroded traditional hierarchies, blurred class boundaries, and produced an armed population accustomed to local autonomy. To ensure stability, Hideyoshi sought to institutionalize peace through social control. His policies aimed to fix each individual within a clearly defined role, farmer, artisan, merchant, or warrior, thereby restoring predictability to a society shaped by chaos. The most famous of these measures was the sword hunt Katanagari of 1588. Edicts ordered the confiscation of weapons from peasants and monks across the country, declaring that the farmer's hoe and the warrior's sword must not be confused. The stated purpose was to prevent uprisings, but the deeper goal was social separation, a definitive boundary between those who produced and those who fought. Archaeological records and surviving edict texts confirm the extent of these operations, which symbolically disarmed the populace and consolidated samurai identity as an exclusive hereditary class. Complementing the sword hunt was the status stabilization policy, Haino Bunri, which prohibited movement between classes. Farmers were tied to the land. Samurai were restricted to castle towns and salaried service. This legal stratification laid the foundations for Japan's early modern social hierarchy, a structure that would later be codified under the Tokugawa shogunate. Hideyoshi's reforms thus created the first coherent civil-military division in Japanese history, replacing the fluid, merit-based mobility of the Sengoku era with static order. Hideyoshi also restructured land governance through an extensive land survey, Taiko Kenchi, begun in the late 1580s. This survey standardized units of measurement and codified ownership across Japan's provinces. Lands were assessed in terms of kakadaka, rice yield capacity, establishing a national tax base that reflected productivity rather than political favor. The kakadaka system introduced fiscal uniformity and bureaucratic oversight, anticipating the rationalized administration that would define Tokugawa governance. As historian Nagahara Keiji observed, this reform transformed local domains into measurable components of a national economy. Religious policy under Hideyoshi reflected both pragmatism and suspicion. Having witnessed Nobunaga's destruction of militant monasteries, Hideyoshi continued to restrict Buddhist institutions but tempered outright persecution with regulation. He also dealt cautiously with Christianity, which had grown rapidly since the arrival of Jesuit missionaries in 1549. Initially tolerant, Hideyoshi turned hostile after 1587, issuing the Batteren Expulsion Edict, citing fears of colonial subversion and divided loyalties. The decree forbade Christian proselytization but was unevenly enforced, reflecting his balancing act between religious control and the economic benefits of European trade. At home, Hideyoshi's rule combined military absolutism with cultural patronage. He embraced the arts of the warrior elite, particularly tea ceremony, shinoyu, as instruments of diplomacy and symbolism. Under the guidance of tea master Sen no Rikyu, Hideyoshi transformed tea gatherings into performances of political order, where aesthetics reinforced hierarchy. His construction of the Jurakudai Palace in Kyoto epitomized this blend of luxury and authority. Visitors noted its gilded walls and vast audience chambers, material expressions of the peace he imposed through power. Having pacified Japan, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward. His ambitions extended beyond the islands toward the Asian continent. Convinced that a unified Japan could now project strength abroad, he envisioned an invasion of Korea as the first step in a grand imperial campaign against Ming China. In 1592, he launched the Imjin War, sending an army of over 150,000 troops across the Korean peninsula, one of the largest overseas invasions in pre-modern history. Initially, the Japanese forces achieved stunning advances, capturing Seoul and pushing deep into the north. However, the campaign soon faltered. Korean naval resistance, led by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, severed supply lines, while Ming reinforcements turned the tide. The conflict devolved into attrition, draining Japan's treasury and manpower. A second invasion in 1597 fared no better. By the time of Hideyoshi's death in 1598, his armies were forced to withdraw, their gains erased. The wars left Korea devastated and Japan economically strained. Historians interpret the Korean invasions as the culmination of Hideyoshi's ambition, a fusion of military pride and political necessity. Having unified Japan, he sought to channel the restless energy of the warrior class outward, maintaining their occupation through conquest rather than internal strife. Yet the campaigns also reveal the limits of his authority. His control was personal, not institutional, dependent on charisma rather than stable succession. In his final years, Hideyoshi turned to securing his legacy. With no legitimate heir of age, he appointed a council of 5 regents, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, to govern until his son Hideyori came of age. He also founded the Toyotomi administration in Osaka Castle, intending it as both fortress and symbol of dynastic permanence. But even as he lay dying, the seeds of future conflict were sown. The regents he trusted were already maneuvering for dominance. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rule represented the apex and exhaustion of the samurai project. He had achieved what no warlord before him had accomplished, the total unification of Japan, but at the cost of freezing its social mobility. The same system that ensured peace stifled innovation. The same reforms that preserved order entrenched hierarchy. Hideyoshi's legacy was therefore paradoxical. A peasant who rose to absolute power, only to codify a society in which no one else could follow his path. From a historical standpoint, Hideyoshi's reign transformed the nature of governance. His bureaucratic rationalization, social engineering, and proto-national administration provided the framework upon which Tokugawa Ieyasu would build the enduring Edo system. His failures, particularly in Korea, demonstrated the limits of personal rule and the dangers of overextension. In both triumph and tragedy, Hideyoshi embodied the tension at the heart of samurai history, the pursuit of unity through conquest and the perpetual struggle to sustain it. But unification would only last as long as his will. In a single day, centuries of chaos ended. Morning mist rolled through the narrow valleys of Sekigahara on October 21, 1600, blurring the line between earth and sky. As the fog lifted, more than 160,000 warriors faced one another across the plain. Banners of gold, red, and black rising like tides of color in the pale light. To the west stood the coalition of Ishida Mitsunari, loyal to the Toyotomi heir. To the east, the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu, lord of Mikawa, a man whose patience had outlasted an age of ambition. When the battle ended, the destiny of Japan itself would tilt toward centuries of peace under his rule. The road to Sekigahara began with the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598. His infant son, Hideyori, was too young to rule, and a council of 5 regents, among them Tokugawa Ieyasu, was appointed to govern in his stead. But the regency was fragile. Old rivalries and private ambitions smoldered beneath its surface. Ieyasu, with vast territories in eastern Japan and unmatched prestige, soon became the most powerful among them. His alliances through marriage, oaths, and rewards bound many daimyo to his cause, while others feared his growing influence. Opposing him was Ishida Mitsunari, a bureaucrat rather than a battlefield commander, yet fiercely loyal to the Toyotomi clan. Mitsunari framed Ieyasu's behavior as treasonous, an attempt to usurp Toyotomi authority. By 1600, Japan divided once more into 2 great blocks, the Eastern Army under Ieyasu and the Western Army under Mitsunari. The struggle was not only for political control but for the very legitimacy of rule. Whether Japan would remain loyal to Hideyoshi's lineage or accept Ieyasu's claim to national stewardship. In the months before the battle, both sides moved rapidly to secure allies. Letters, promises, and threats crossed the archipelago. Castles shifted allegiance overnight. The outcome, though military in form, would be decided as much by diplomacy and timing as by the sword. Ieyasu's strength lay in his strategic patience, a cautious, deliberate temperament forged over decades of survival. As chroniclers note, he moved not as the tiger pounces, but as the mountain endures. By early autumn, the armies converged near Sekigahara, a fog-shrouded basin in Mino province, strategically placed between the eastern and western domains. Ieyasu's army, roughly 75,000 strong, advanced westward. Mitsunari's, numbering around 80,000, blocked his path. As dawn broke on October 21st, the field was enveloped in mist so dense that soldiers could barely see their own banners. When the fog lifted, the fate of a nation stood revealed in the cold air. The Battle of Sekigahara began with volleys of arquebus fire echoing through the valley. Initial engagements favored the Western Army, whose higher position and defensive alignment gave them early advantage. But Ieyasu's plan rested not on brute force but betrayal. Several daimyo within Mitsunari's coalition, notably Kobayakawa Hideaki, who commanded 16,000 men on the southern flank, had been secretly courted by Ieyasu. Throughout the morning, Hideaki hesitated, watching the tide of battle. Then, around noon, Ieyasu ordered his artillery to fire warning shots toward Hideaki's position. A signal, perhaps a threat. Moments later, Hideaki's troops turned their spears against the Western army. His defection caused a chain reaction. Neighboring contingents under Wakasaka Yasuharu and Ogawa Suketada followed suit. Within hours, the Western lines collapsed. Mitsunari's army, surrounded and disintegrating, fled in all directions. By mid-afternoon, victory belonged to Tokugawa Ieyasu. The field of Sekigahara was strewn with the remnants of 2 centuries of civil war. Fallen banners, broken armor, and the bodies of samurai who had fought for a fractured dream of unity. Chroniclers record that blood and mist mingled, and the crows of Mino fed for 3 days. Ieyasu himself surveyed the carnage in silence before reportedly declaring, "Now, the realm is mine." In the weeks that followed, Ieyasu moved swiftly to consolidate power. Thousands of prisoners from the Western coalition were executed or dispossessed. Loyal daimyo were rewarded with vast new territories, their holdings redistributed in a calculated act of political geometry. Allies were moved closer to the capital. Potential rivals were scattered to distant provinces. This land redistribution, tenkabushin, effectively redrew the political map of Japan, ensuring that those who owed their status to Ieyasu's favor could not easily turn against him. In 1603, Ieyasu received the title of Taishogun shogun from the emperor, formalizing what had already become reality, the Tokugawa shogunate. Though he would retire 2 years later in favor of his son Hidetada, Ieyasu remained the ultimate authority until his death in 1616. His government established its base not in Kyoto, the imperial capital, nor in Osaka, the Toyotomi stronghold, but in Edo, a fishing village transformed into a new administrative heart of Japan. Edo's selection was a masterstroke. Situated in the fertile Kanto Plain and facing the Pacific, it was geographically secure, distant from old centers of power yet close enough to oversee the empire's arteries of trade. From its moated castle radiated a new order built on bureaucratic precision, surveillance, and hereditary hierarchy. The age of roaming warlords was over. The samurai would now serve as administrators and stewards. The victory at Sekigahara was thus more than a military triumph. It was the birth of an ideology. The Tokugawa regime envisioned peace not as a pause between wars, but as a permanent condition, engineered through obedience and restraint. The sword, once a symbol of chaos, became a badge of controlled power. Ieyasu's genius lay not in conquest alone but in institutional vision. Having seen the rise and fall of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, he understood that unity could not rest on personal charisma or constant campaigning. It required a durable architecture of governance, laws, vassal obligations, and an economy rooted in predictable stability. Sekigahara provided the foundation upon which that architecture would stand. In retrospect, the battle's significance was total. It ended a century and a half of feudal warfare and ushered in the Edo period, a peace that would last more than 250 years. Yet this peace was not freedom. It was discipline. The world the samurai had made with the sword would now be maintained by the pen, through registers, codes, and surveillance. Now the sword would serve the pen. Peace turned the samurai into scholars. When Tokugawa Ieyasu established his government in Edo in 1603, he did not simply create a new military regime. He built an entire architecture of control, designed to outlast the ambitions of any single man. The Tokugawa Bakufu, or shogunate, functioned as a highly structured hierarchy, its purpose not conquest but stability. The lessons of the Sengoku centuries had been clear. Japan's future could not rest on personal loyalty or shifting alliances. It required a self-sustaining order that balanced coercion, bureaucracy, and ritualized subordination. At its core, the Tokugawa system was a dual polity. The emperor in Kyoto retained religious and symbolic authority, but the shogun in Edo wielded all real power. This separation preserved the illusion of imperial continuity while ensuring that the Bakufu's legitimacy could never be directly challenged. Ieyasu's successors carefully maintained this duality. Official decrees still bore the imperial seal, but all decisions were drafted and enacted under shogunal supervision. This arrangement allowed the Tokugawa state to appear ancient, even as it imposed a profoundly new form of rule. The Bakufu's political foundation rested on three interconnected pillars: land control, vassal hierarchy, and administrative discipline. After Sekigahara, Ieyasu conducted an extensive land survey, kenchi, to assess the productivity and value of every domain. Territories were categorized according to their annual rice yield, measured in koku, one koku representing the amount of rice required to feed one person for a year. A daimyo's wealth and status were thus defined not by the size of his lands, but by their economic capacity, a system that allowed the shogunate to quantify loyalty in measurable, taxable terms. The lords of Japan were divided into three major classes. The shinpan, or collateral houses, were Tokugawa relatives who held key territories near Edo. The fudai, or hereditary vassals, were daimyo who had supported Ieyasu before Sekigahara and were rewarded with strategic domains. The tozuma, or outside lords, had joined the Tokugawa cause later, often reluctantly. They retained their lands but were kept under careful surveillance, confined to distant regions such as Kyushu and Tohoku. This geographic and political arrangement formed the keystone of Tokugawa security: loyalty at the center, isolation at the periphery. Edo itself became the administrative brain of this system. Its sprawling castle complex, surrounded by concentric moats and broad avenues, symbolized both authority and order. Within it, the roju, or senior counselors, oversaw national policy, while the wakado shiori managed routine governance and communications between the shogunate and the daimyo. Beneath them, a vast bureaucratic apparatus handled finance, taxation, temple registration, and the regulation of urban guilds. By the mid-17th century, Edo had evolved from a military encampment into one of the largest cities in the world, home to more than 1 million people and functioning as both seat of government and model of urban control. The Tokugawa system sought to domesticate power. Samurai who had once lived by the sword were now expected to live by the brush. Service to a lord became an administrative duty, not a martial one. The bushi were salaried retainers, compensated in rice stipends rather than autonomous fiefs. Their function shifted from fighting to managing, overseeing local taxation, enforcing laws, and maintaining records. This transformation represented a profound ideological shift. The samurai's virtue was now expressed through discipline, literacy, and loyalty within peace, rather than valor in war. To ensure discipline among the domains, the shogunate implemented the alternate attendance system, or sankin-kotai, in the 1630s under Tokugawa Iemitsu. Each daimyo was required to maintain 2 residences, one in his home domain and one in Edo, and to spend alternate years in each. During his absence, his family remained in Edo as de facto hostages, guaranteeing his loyalty. The journeys themselves were enormous undertakings. Retinues of hundreds or even thousands of retainers marched along the Takedo Road, transforming the system into both a political theater and an economic engine. Sankin-kotai served multiple functions. Politically, it prevented daimyo from amassing resources for rebellion, since half their wealth was consumed by the cost of travel and dual residence. Economically, it stimulated commerce along Japan's major routes, supporting the growth of inns, ports, and towns. Culturally, it centralized social life around Edo, whose population expanded rapidly as artisans, merchants, and entertainers catered to the constant flow of samurai officials. This system of controlled mobility was one of the most effective instruments of centralized authority in pre-modern history. Underlying these administrative controls was a rigid social hierarchy that codified Japan's feudal order. At its apex stood the samurai, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants, the so-called Shirno-Kyousho structure. In theory, this hierarchy reflected Confucian ideals: those who governed, those who produced, those who crafted, and those who traded. In practice, it functioned to stabilize social expectations and restrict movement between classes. The samurai's privilege was balanced by duty, the peasant's burden, by presumed moral worth as food producer. The Tokugawa viewed society as an organism that must be regulated through moral order as much as through law. Neo-Confucianism, imported from China and adapted by Japanese scholars such as Hayashi Reisen, became the ideological backbone of the regime. It emphasized loyalty to one's superior, filial piety, and the natural hierarchy of ruler and subject. Samurai education, once centered on martial training, now focused on ethics, calligraphy, and history. A warrior's sword was still worn as a badge of class, but it was increasingly ceremonial, a symbol of moral restraint rather than active violence. Archaeological and textual evidence from the early Edo period supports this transformation. Excavations at Edo and Kanazawa reveal extensive administrative compounds, paper archives, and weapon storage transitioning to civil infrastructure. Inkstones replacing spear racks. Contemporary manuals such as the Byukushohato, Laws for the Military Houses, first issued in 1615, codified proper behavior, restricting private fortifications, marriages, and alliances among daimyo. The samurai had become the bureaucratic spine of a military state that no longer needed to fight. The transformation was not without tension. As warfare ceased, many lower-ranking samurai found themselves impoverished. Their stipends were fixed, while the cost of living in castle towns increased. The rise of a wealthy merchant class, officially ranked lowest but economically dynamic, further inverted the ideological order. Samurai families, though socially superior, often relied on loans from merchants to maintain their status. This contradiction between ideological hierarchy and economic reality would grow steadily through the Tokugawa centuries, eroding the moral foundation of the regime even as it maintained political peace. Nevertheless, for much of the 17th century, the system worked with remarkable efficiency. The daimyo domains, Han, operated semi-autonomously, but under strict supervision. Each domain was required to provide detailed reports on its finances, population, and defenses. The shogunate's inspectors, or metsuke, traveled regularly to ensure compliance. Through these layers of oversight, the Tokugawa achieved a form of decentralized centralization, an empire of obligation rather than occupation. The regime's control extended into the private sphere through the temple registration system, Terayuke, instituted in the 1630s. Every household was required to affiliate with a Buddhist temple, both to ensure record-keeping and to identify potential converts to Christianity. This network, combined with the Sakoku, closed country, edicts of the 1630s, 1640s, produced an insular, tightly monitored society. The goal was not isolation for its own sake, but internal coherence. A Japan secure from both foreign influence and domestic disorder. The Tokugawa peace had far-reaching consequences for Japan's intellectual life. With stability ensured, the samurai class turned to study. Domain schools, Hanko, proliferated, teaching Confucian texts, classical Chinese literature, and practical governance. The ideal retainer was now a man of letters as much as of arms. As one Edo scholar wrote, "The pen perfects what the sword began." Literacy rates among samurai exceeded 80% by the 18th century, among the highest in the pre-industrial world. At the same time, the merchant townspeople, kanen, developed their own urban culture, theater, publishing, and art, indirectly financed by the stipends of the warrior class. Ironically, the very peace that had elevated the samurai also diluted their distinctiveness. As commerce flourished and martial necessity faded, the warrior's role became increasingly symbolic. His armor gathered dust, his sword ceremonial, his duty administrative. Historians note that this transformation produced a unique paradox: a military elite without war. The samurai retained privilege and authority but lacked the function that had originally justified them. Their code, later idealized as Bushido, emerged not from the chaos of battle but from the stability of bureaucracy, a retrospective effort to give moral coherence to a class in search of purpose. The writings of Yamaga Soko and later Yamamoto Tsunetomo Hagakure reflected this anxiety: how to live as a warrior when there were no wars to fight. The Tokugawa administrative machine thus operated on two intertwined principles: moral hierarchy, and systemic surveillance. The first provided ideological legitimacy, the second ensured practical obedience. Each daimyo, each samurai, each village headman occupied a fixed position in a network of accountability. Records were kept with obsessive precision. Correspondence was monitored. Roads and passes were guarded. Through this lattice of regulation, the Bakufu sustained peace for more than 2 centuries without the need for large standing armies. By the mid-17th century, the transformation of Japan was complete. From a land of warring lords emerged a bureaucratic feudalism, static, predictable, and self-regulating. Yet beneath the calm surface, contradictions persisted. The same peace that stabilized society also froze it in place, preventing adaptation to economic and technological change. The samurai, now administrators and scholars, would find themselves trapped between nostalgia for the past and the demands of a modernizing economy. But peace also eroded the reason for their existence. The sword remained, but mostly as a symbol. By the early 17th century, the samurai had ceased to be a warrior in the literal sense. The long peace of Tokugawa rule rendered battlefields obsolete and shifted the samurai's purpose from combat to governance. In the new order, his weapon marked status, not occupation. The sword, worn in pairs as the daisho, no longer represented readiness for war but rather moral authority and class distinction. The Tokugawa Bakufu required every samurai to carry it, even as it ensured that most would never draw it in anger. The economic foundation of this transformation lay in the stipend system. Rather than ruling autonomous fiefs, most samurai became retainers bound to a domain, han, receiving annual rice payments calculated in koku. This change made them dependents of their lords, erasing the land-based autonomy that had once defined feudal power. Stipends were fixed, often generationally, which guaranteed stability but introduced fragility. As inflation rose and commerce expanded, samurai income lagged behind. Many found themselves status-rich but cash-poor, forced to borrow from merchants they were officially forbidden to associate with. Archaeological evidence and household records from Edo, Kanazawa, and Himeji domains reveal the economic pressures of this stipend economy. Items such as pawn swords, account ledgers, and debtor contracts suggest that by the late 17th century, debt had become endemic among the lower and middle samurai ranks. A class that once derived prestige from mastery of arms now measured dignity through the maintenance of appearances, house size, attire, and participation in domain rituals. Their lives were marked by ritual austerity and bureaucratic precision rather than military valor. The transformation of the samurai into an administrative class was accompanied by a profound intellectual redefinition of duty. The Tokugawa regime promoted Neo-Confucianism as the ethical foundation of social order. Thinkers such as Hayashi Reisen and his descendants served as official scholars to the shogunate, systematizing Confucian doctrine into a state ideology. Reisen's writings emphasized loyalty, chu, and filial piety, ko, as twin pillars of virtue, framing the samurai service not merely as political obedience but as moral discipline. The warrior, once defined by courage in battle, was now the exemplar of inner restraint and ethical conduct. Education became the central instrument of this moral governance. Domain schools, hanko, were established throughout Japan, offering instruction in the Confucian classics, history, mathematics, and law. Attendance was effectively mandatory for samurai youth, ensuring ideological consistency and administrative competence. Surviving curricula from the Eizu and Kumamoto domains show that instruction emphasized decorum, hierarchy, and the practical application of Confucian principles in governance. Through education, the Tokugawa state cultivated a class of literate functionaries capable of managing a complex bureaucratic society. Samurai literacy extended beyond official learning. Many became poets, calligraphers, or chroniclers of local history. Their literary output, from moral essays to administrative manuals, reveals an acute awareness of their new role. The writings of Yamaga Soko, 1622–1685, for instance, reframed the samurai as a moral model for all classes, arguing that since he no longer fought, his duty lay in embodying virtue through study and self-discipline. Soko's Kanen Bushido anticipated later reinterpretations of samurai ethics, emphasizing that social order required not strength of arms but strength of principle. This intellectualization of the warrior ideal produced a hybrid identity, the scholar samurai. In domains such as Mido and Chashu, samurai officials became historians, compiling monumental chronicles like the Dai Nihonshu, History of Great Japan, which sought to align loyalty to the shogunate with reverence for the imperial tradition. These works reflected a tension inherent in Tokugawa ideology. While the samurai served the shogun, their moral education still linked ultimate legitimacy to the emperor. The balance between pragmatic service and moral hierarchy defined samurai thought throughout the Edo period. Material culture offers further evidence of this transformation. Excavations at Edo and Osaka reveal writing desks, inkstones, and official seals among samurai residences, artifacts of bureaucratic life. Manuals such as the Byukushohato, Laws for the Military Houses, 1615 and later revisions, regulated not only military conduct but household decorum and inheritance. A samurai's virtue was measured by punctuality, modesty, and loyalty, not by martial achievement. Even dueling, once a point of honor, was restricted by law, reinforcing the ideal of controlled restraint. The daily rhythm of the samurai bureaucrat mirrored the routines of governance. Most worked as clerks, inspectors, or tax officials, their tasks consisting of ledger management, correspondence, and local dispute resolution. Reports from the Metsuke, shogunal inspectors, show that officials were evaluated not for bravery, but for diligence and propriety. Administrative errors could end a career more quickly than cowardice once had. The warrior's battlefield was now the office, and his weapons were pen, seal, and memoranda. Despite this pacification, the samurai remained culturally dominant. Their presence structured urban society. Castle towns, jokamichi, were designed around their residences, and samurai etiquette dictated dress codes, language, and behavior even among commoners. The entire Tokugawa social order functioned through ritualized deference, in which every rank acknowledged its superior. This cultural formalism reinforced stability but also rigidified the class system, making upward mobility nearly impossible. The samurai's literary and philosophical life deepened this sense of moral exclusivity. Many cultivated Zen or Confucian meditation as a means of self-regulation. The influence of Zen, transmitted through arts such as ink painting, tea ceremony, and poetry, offered an inward balance to the outward formality of Confucian ethics. The resulting synthesis, disciplined, introspective, and ordered, shaped the aesthetic of Edo governance. The official who could control his mind was thought capable of controlling his domain. Yet this ideal concealed growing contradictions. The same peace that elevated the samurai as moral guardians also deprived them of economic independence. By the early 18th century, debt crises and stipend shortfalls forced many into humiliating dependence on merchant creditors. Official correspondence from the Tokugawa Council records frequent concern about samurai engaging in commerce, forbidden by law yet often necessary for survival. This dissonance between ideological purity and material necessity eroded the confidence of the class. Nonetheless, the Tokugawa period preserved the illusion of harmony through ritual and intellectual coherence. The samurai bureaucrat embodied the regime's central paradox. He was both enforcer and servant of a peace that negated his original purpose. His loyalty was maintained not through the promise of glory but through an intricate web of moral obligation and administrative accountability. The ideal was no longer the warrior who conquered, but the official who obeyed. By the 18th century, this model had become so institutionalized that few could imagine an alternative. The samurai's descendants continued to study, serve, and record, perpetuating an identity rooted in service rather than struggle. Even as their economic position weakened, their cultural influence endured, shaping education, etiquette, and philosophy across all classes. The Tokugawa peace had remade the samurai into the civil servants of a moralized state, guardians not of territory, but of order itself. Symbols, however, can outlast institutions. Bushido was never ancient, it was invented peace. By the time the word Bushido entered common use in the Tokugawa period, the age of war that had given birth to the samurai was long gone. What emerged in its place was not a code born from the battlefield, but an intellectual construct designed to justify the samurai's continued existence in an era that no longer required warriors. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was less a survival of medieval custom than a moral invention of stability, shaped by Confucian ethics and state ideology. The Tokugawa shogunate had a delicate task. It needed to preserve a warrior class without war. To do so, it transformed military virtue into moral virtue, recasting loyalty and discipline as civic values rather than violent necessities. The ideological glue for this transformation was Neo-Confucianism, imported from Ming China and adapted by Japanese scholars such as Hayashi Reisen and Yamazaki Onsai. Their synthesis of Confucian hierarchy with native feudal loyalty laid the foundation for what would later be mythologized as the samurai ethic. Confucianism emphasized order through moral relationships. Ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend. Each role carried obligations defined by propriety, li, and righteousness, e. The Tokugawa regime mapped this moral geometry onto its social system, defining every subject's place within an unbroken chain of deference. The samurai standing just below the shogun were framed as the embodiment of moral clarity, the class that must demonstrate, through behavior and restraint, the virtues the rest of society should imitate. For Hayashi Reisen, the samurai's loyalty, chu, mirrored the Confucian virtue of filial piety, ko. Service to one's lord was an extension of obedience to one's father, both acts of moral harmony. In this sense, Bushido did not contradict Confucianism. It translated it into feudal terms. The sword became a metaphor for ethical vigilance, the sharp edge of duty that must remain pure even when never drawn. Reisen's writings and his descendants' commentaries established a Confucianized Bushido, where the essence of the warrior's life was not combat but correctness. This philosophical transformation found literary form in the manuals and treatises that proliferated from the 17th century onward. Works such as the Budo Shoshinshu, 1716, attributed to Daidoji Yuzan, urged samurai to live each day as though they might die tomorrow, not in battle, but through unwavering loyalty and service. The famous injunctions of Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagikure, circa 1716, pushed this ethos further, declaring that the way of the samurai is found in death. Yet this obsession with death was paradoxical. It emerged precisely when no wars were being fought. The Tokugawa samurai contemplated death as a metaphor for devotion, transforming martial courage into moral stoicism. In this way, Bushido became a language of ideals rather than realities. Historical samurai of earlier centuries had often been opportunists, shifting allegiances, seizing lands, and betraying lords when expedient. But Tokugawa ideologues, seeking to freeze society into moral hierarchy, reimagined the samurai as paragons of selfless fidelity. The code they described owed more to philosophy than to history. In practice, samurai life in Edo Japan revolved around administration, protocol, and debt, not duels and heroic deaths. Yet the ideal persisted, serving both as personal consolation and political propaganda. Neo-Confucian ethics offered a ready justification for this gap between myth and reality. It taught that virtue lies in intention, not outcome. The samurai who performed his duty with sincerity embodied righteousness even without fighting. Thus, a peaceful bureaucrat could claim the same moral grandeur once reserved for battlefield heroes. This reinterpretation allowed the Tokugawa state to maintain the samurai's prestige, crucial to sustaining obedience from below, while disarming the class that once threatened it. Over time, however, Bushido evolved into something more than mere state doctrine. Thinkers like Yamazaki Onsai, who fused Confucian ethics with Shinto reverence for the emperor, transformed the idea into a spiritual discipline. His doctrine of Suka Shinto linked loyalty to one's lord with loyalty to the divine order of the nation, giving Bushido a cosmic dimension. The samurai's obedience thus became a reflection of universal harmony, a theology of duty that sanctified hierarchy itself. This blend of Confucian hierarchy, Shinto devotion, and Zen discipline produced the tripartite moral world of the Edo samurai. Confucianism provided structure. Shinto gave spiritual legitimacy. Zen offered inner composure. The meditative calm of Zen, with its emphasis on immediacy, acceptance, and death awareness, harmonized with Bushido's moral absolutism. The empty mind of the swordsman, celebrated in martial arts and calligraphy alike, symbolized the fusion of stillness and readiness at the heart of the Tokugawa ideal. Yet this synthesis also contained deep contradictions. The Confucian system valued life and family, while the Bushido myth glorified readiness for death. Confucian propriety emphasized measured conduct. Zen transcendence urged detachment from worldly norms. The Tokugawa samurai lived within these tensions, balancing obedience with introspection, hierarchy with individual conscience. The more peace persisted, the more their ideology became a theater of memory, preserving the illusion of heroic struggle in a world of paperwork and ritual. By the 18th century, Bushido had become a mirror for social anxieties. As economic hardship eroded samurai dignity, moralists doubled down on idealized loyalty, preaching virtue as compensation for lost status. Texts like Hagakure and Shido, The Way of the Gentleman, were less guides for living than elegies for a vanishing class. They preserved the language of courage while lamenting the loss of meaning that peace had imposed. The enduring power of Bushido lay precisely in its contradictory nature. It was both moral system and nostalgic fiction, an invented tradition that allowed Japan's warrior elite to transform defeat into virtue. The Tokugawa state, far from suppressing it, institutionalized this ideal as part of its cultural order. Through education, ceremony, and art, the image of the noble samurai became a stabilizing myth, a reminder that even obedience could possess dignity if framed as self-sacrifice. In the end, Bushido's greatest achievement was not in shaping conduct but in shaping memory. It redefined what it meant to serve, to live, and to die honorably within a world that no longer rewarded heroism. Its contradictions would later fuel both admiration and unease, a code born of peace that dreamed endlessly of war. As ideas grew rigid, reality began to change. While the samurai read Confucius, the townspeople wrote plays. The Edo period was not only a time of administrative consolidation and moral codification. It was also an era of profound urban transformation. As samurai settled into bureaucratic life, castle towns, jokamichi, grew into bustling urban centers, hosting artisans, merchants, and entertainers whose activities both depended on and contrasted with the samurai class. Cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became hubs of commerce, literacy, and cultural innovation, reflecting a prosperity that peace had made possible. Population growth in these urban centers was remarkable. Edo, the shogunal capital, expanded from a modest castle town to a metropolis exceeding 1 million residents by the 18th century. Osaka, the economic heart of rice trade, attracted merchants and financiers who supplied samurai stipends, regulated markets, and organized credit networks. Kyoto, although politically diminished, remained a center of artistic production and imperial ritual. These cities were densely structured, with streets, canals, and neighborhoods organized according to occupation and social rank. The proximity of samurai administration to merchant activity created both oversight and opportunity, shaping the distinctive rhythm of Edo urban life. The townspeople, or kanen, became the engine of cultural production. Their leisure and disposable income fostered entertainment forms that catered to their tastes and satirized the rigidity of samurai society. Kabuki theater, originating in the early 17th century, transformed from religious dance into a highly stylized performance genre. Kabuki combined music, dance, and dramatic storytelling, often depicting historical events or romanticized contemporary life. Its popularity highlighted the contrast between samurai ideals and urban realities. While samurai pursued moral education, townspeople celebrated indulgence, wit, and creativity. Visual culture also flourished. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, depicting courtesans, actors, landscapes, and daily life became both art and commodity. Prints circulated widely, reflecting the tastes of a literate, urban population eager to consume images of fashion, theater, and urban events. Unlike samurai paintings, which emphasized disciplined brushwork and moral symbolism, ukiyo-e embraced dynamism and commercial appeal. Archaeological finds, including printing blocks and surviving editions, attest to the scale and sophistication of this industry by the 18th century. Literacy expanded alongside urban growth. Temple schools, Terrakoya, provided basic reading and writing instruction for children of townspeople, while apprenticeships and guilds reinforced professional skills. Urban populations could now read plays, pamphlets, and manuals, enabling a culture of discussion, critique, and shared knowledge. Print culture disseminated both entertainment and practical information, from travel guides to medical advice, creating an increasingly informed citizenry. The samurai's monopoly on literacy was eroding, even as their social prestige persisted. Economic specialization also shaped cultural life. Merchants accumulated wealth that rivaled the incomes of mid-ranking samurai, funding luxury goods, theater patronage, and artistic production. The rise of a consumer economy encouraged innovation. Tea houses, pleasure districts, and merchant guilds all thrived under Tokugawa oversight. The shogunate tolerated these activities because they stimulated commerce without threatening political stability. In effect, Edo society evolved a duality. Samurai performed austerity and moral guidance, while townspeople pursued wealth, leisure, and creative expression. Urbanization transformed not only culture but also social perception. The Kanin were simultaneously dependent on samurai stipends and culturally autonomous, creating tension and innovation. Samurai moral instruction, Neo-Confucian ethics, and Bushido ideals provided the framework of authority, but the lived experience of urban prosperity often contradicted these ideals. Kabuki scripts and ukiyo-e prints frequently critiqued authority figures, celebrated cunning over obedience, and depicted everyday life with a realism absent from samurai manuals. This tension reflected a broader dynamic. Tokugawa stability permitted cultural experimentation even as it sought to regulate society through hierarchy and moral doctrine. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Edo urban culture had become a complex ecosystem, administration, commerce, and artistry interwoven. Samurai literacy, discipline, and ritual coexisted with the townspeople's flourishing entertainment, print culture, and commercial ingenuity. The resulting society was both structured and vibrant, reflecting the consequences of prolonged peace. Where the samurai maintained symbolic order, the urban population cultivated practical, expressive, and economically grounded forms of life. This contrast reveals a central feature of Edo Japan. Stability created space for both control and innovation. While the samurai upheld the ideology of hierarchy, the townspeople exploited the opportunities afforded by it. Cultural and economic modernization was already taking root beneath the feet of a society that appeared outwardly uniform and disciplined. The Edo period thus set the stage for future challenges to the samurai class, as economic power, literacy, and cultural influence increasingly resided outside the warrior elite. Modernity was already taking root beneath their feet. By the 1800s, many samurai were poorer than the peasants they once commanded. The prolonged peace of the Tokugawa era, while ensuring political stability, imposed a hidden economic burden on the samurai class. Retainers were paid fixed stipends, denominated in rice, which became increasingly inadequate as population growth, urbanization, and commercialization raised living costs. Domains struggled to maintain these payments, and many samurai found themselves living beyond their means. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the situation had become acute. Records from Edo, Osaka, and Kanazawa indicate that a significant proportion of mid-ranking and lower samurai carried substantial debts, often owed to the very merchants over whom they had once held social dominance. The disparity between stipends and actual expenditures created a systemic financial vulnerability. Samurai households faced fixed obligations, including domain-imposed taxes, ceremonial duties, and maintenance of attire and residences befitting their rank. At the same time, the rise of a wealthy Kanin merchant class introduced competition in luxury consumption. Merchants could command cash wealth far exceeding the rice-based stipends of samurai, and samurai households frequently had to borrow from them to cover daily expenses. These loans were officially discouraged, as commerce was considered beneath a warrior's dignity. Yet the dependence on merchant credit became widespread. Evidence of this economic stress is found in household ledgers, pawn records, and official correspondence. A notable example is the Kanazawa domain accounts, late 18th century, which document repeated stipends falling short of household expenditures by 30 to 50%, forcing samurai to liquidate family heirlooms or enter debt contracts. In some cases, retainers resorted to side occupations including teaching, writing, or even commercial activity, practices that the shogunate formally discouraged but tacitly tolerated. These adjustments reflect the tension between status preservation and economic necessity, a recurring challenge in a society organized by hierarchy rather than market logic. Population pressures compounded the problem. Samurai families were expected to maintain male heirs in service and support dependents. Larger households multiplied obligations without increasing stipends. Economic strain disproportionately affected younger or lower-ranking samurai, who had fewer opportunities for domain appointments and supplemental income. The resulting socio-economic stratification within the warrior class eroded cohesion and morale. While upper-ranking daimyo retained financial stability, the majority of retainers increasingly relied on loans and subsidies from both domain authorities and merchant lenders. Merchants, for their part, exploited this situation. By providing credit, controlling markets, and accumulating wealth, they inverted the social hierarchy in practical terms. Though still legally inferior to the samurai, merchants wielded economic power that often exceeded that of mid-level retainers. Contemporary complaints in samurai diaries frequently note embarrassment and resentment over borrowing from commercial households, illustrating a subtle erosion of social prestige. The irony was clear. The peace that enabled bureaucratic refinement also created the conditions for financial dependence. Reform efforts by the shogunate were largely reactive and limited in scope. Some domains attempted to adjust stipends, reduce household obligations, or encourage commercial engagement among retainers. Others implemented austerity measures, restricting marriage expenses, clothing, or lodging. Such reforms met with mixed results, often generating resentment among samurai accustomed to a standard of living tied to status rather than productivity. The disparity between ideology and reality became increasingly apparent. A class founded on honor and service now struggled to maintain subsistence. Debt crises also had wider political implications. Samurai indebtedness created internal pressures within domains, reducing loyalty and increasing susceptibility to factionalism. Some retainers challenged domain authority over stipend distribution. Others sought opportunities for personal advancement outside traditional bureaucratic channels. These pressures, combined with economic stagnation, contributed to a gradual erosion of centralized Tokugawa control in the late Edo period. Documents from the Bakumatsu era indicate that several domains faced open disputes between financially burdened samurai and domain administrators, reflecting systemic weaknesses in governance. The financial decline of the samurai coincided with shifts in social mobility among commoners. Educated merchants and artisans increasingly leveraged literacy, financial skills, and networks to accumulate wealth, cultural influence, and even political leverage. Urban centers became spaces where economic clout challenged hereditary privilege, further highlighting the samurai's dependence on non-military actors. Cultural and commercial patronage, once monopolized by the warrior elite, gradually shifted toward merchants, theater guilds, and urban artisans, signaling both the material and symbolic erosion of samurai dominance. These pressures set the stage for ideological and institutional responses. Domains began experimenting with administrative reforms, attempting to integrate merchant expertise into governance and encourage samurai participation in economic activity without fully legitimizing commerce as a warrior pursuit. The Kansei reforms, 1787 to 1793, and other late Tokugawa policy initiatives illustrate efforts to stabilize the samurai class while maintaining hierarchical ideals. However, the structural mismatch between fixed rice stipends and a cash-based economy remained largely unresolved, leaving many retainers in chronic financial precarity. In sum, by the 19th century, the Tokugawa samurai faced a dual crisis: material scarcity and ideological tension. Their stipends no longer ensured livelihood, their social authority was increasingly symbolic, and their dependence on merchants undermined traditional hierarchies. Economic decline eroded both autonomy and morale, revealing the fragility of a system built on peace and moral codes rather than sustained military or economic power. Samurai, once the backbone of feudal Japan, were now constrained by the very stability that had once elevated them. Poverty breeds reform and rebellion. When the black ships came, the samurai's world cracked open. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had maintained a policy of sakoku, or national seclusion, limiting foreign contact to strictly regulated trade at Nagasaki with the Dutch, Chinese, and select Ryukyuan intermediaries. This policy preserved political stability and cultural continuity, but it also insulated Japan from rapid technological and geopolitical changes occurring elsewhere. By the mid-19th century, the industrialized powers of Europe and North America increasingly pressured Japan to open its ports, exposing a structural vulnerability in a state that had relied on isolation for 200 years. The decisive moment came in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Edo Bay with a fleet of steam-powered warships, later known as the Black Ships. Perry's mission was to force the opening of Japanese ports to American trade and ensure protection for shipwrecked sailors. His arrival demonstrated the technological and military gap between Japan and the Western powers. The samurai, trained for centuries in conventional weapons and local warfare, were confronted with steam engines, rifled cannons, and industrialized logistics, rendering their martial skills comparatively obsolete. The Bakufu faced an immediate crisis of authority. Tokugawa leaders were divided over how to respond. Some advocated negotiation and controlled engagement, while others argued for armed resistance, adhering to the ideal of samurai defense of sovereignty. Perry's show of force underscored the futility of isolation in the face of modern weaponry, compelling the shogunate to sign the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854, granting limited port access and initiating a series of unequal treaties with the United States, Britain, Russia, and France. These treaties ceded extraterritorial rights to foreigners, imposed fixed tariffs, and exposed Japan to diplomatic humiliation, challenging both political authority and social hierarchy. The shock of foreign incursion generated deep ideological and practical divisions among the samurai class. On one side were loyalists to the shogunate, who emphasized obedience and incremental reform to preserve order. On the other were reformist and nationalist samurai, often from southern domains such as Satsuma and Chashu, who argued that the Tokugawa system was inherently incapable of defending Japan against industrialized powers. Texts, petitions, and memorials from this period show intense debate over military modernization, domain autonomy, and the role of foreign knowledge. Samurai intellectuals, long trained in Confucian ethics and martial discipline, now confronted technological imperatives that required adaptation, not ideology. The unequal treaties magnified the economic and social pressures already undermining samurai prestige. Merchants gained increasing influence by managing foreign trade and currency exchange, further shifting economic power away from stipendiary warriors. Samurai administrators, many untrained in commercial or industrial matters, faced growing irrelevance in policymaking. Domains capable of adopting Western military technologies, guns, cannons, and steam navigation, gained both prestige and power, while traditional retainers risked obsolescence. This discrepancy highlighted the gap between samurai ideology and strategic reality, eroding confidence in hereditary authority. Military modernization became a central point of contention. Reformist samurai pushed for the adoption of Western arms and training methods, arguing that the preservation of Japanese sovereignty demanded rapid change. Historical records from the Satsuma and Chashu domains indicate recruitment of instructors, acquisition of firearms, and construction of modernized arsenals beginning in the 1850s. Meanwhile, conservative samurai lamented the erosion of traditional martial culture, emphasizing swordsmanship and ritual discipline. This tension between innovation and tradition framed much of the internal debate leading to the Bakumatsu period, 1853 to 1868. Culturally, foreign contact challenged long-held assumptions about social hierarchy. Samurai were accustomed to unquestioned deference, but the presence of foreign diplomats, traders, and armed envoys created situations where status could no longer guarantee authority. The inability to assert dominance in interactions with Western powers exposed the limits of the samurai's symbolic capital. Contemporary diaries describe feelings of humiliation, anxiety, and urgency among samurai officials, revealing that the crisis was not solely material but psychological and social. Perry's expeditions also catalyzed political activism. Domains previously peripheral to central power began asserting influence, leveraging reformist agendas to challenge the Bakufu. Satsuma, Chashu, and Tosa became centers of resistance, producing samurai who combined traditional loyalty with strategic opportunism. Histories of the period show coordinated domain efforts to acquire Western knowledge, modernize arsenals, and build proto-nationalist ideologies. The Sano-Joy movement, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, emerged as both a response to foreign pressure and a critique of Tokugawa failure, illustrating how external threats reshaped internal politics. This convergence of economic strain, ideological tension, and technological disparity produced an unprecedented erosion of the Tokugawa order. Samurai, once the arbiters of authority and morality, found themselves forced to choose between maintaining symbolic status and engaging with modernity. Those who resisted reform risked irrelevance, while those who embraced change had to navigate conflicts between tradition and innovation. Primary sources, including domain letters and samurai essays, reveal intense debate over the legitimacy of foreign knowledge, the preservation of social hierarchy, and the role of martial ethics in a rapidly changing world. The end result was a fragmented samurai class, divided between loyalist and reformist factions. This division was both political and strategic. Domains capable of modernization gained influence, while the Bakufu struggled to assert control over the entire archipelago. The arrival of foreign powers had exposed the structural weaknesses of hereditary military governance, accelerating the decline that had already begun under economic and bureaucratic pressures. Samurai could no longer rely on stipends, prestige, or traditional military skill to maintain dominance. In retrospect, the arrival of the black ships was not merely a diplomatic event. It was a catalyst for systemic transformation. Tokugawa isolation had preserved order at the cost of adaptability, and the sudden exposure to industrialized powers created both crisis and opportunity. Reformist samurai harnessed this shock to reshape military, administrative, and ideological practices, while the Bakufu struggled to maintain authority within a framework that no longer matched global realities. The consequences of this confrontation would unfold in the years leading to the Meiji Restoration, as the samurai's economic, cultural, and political roles were redefined in the face of modern nationhood. From those cracks, a new Japan would emerge. The emperor returned, and the samurai vanished. The final decades of the Tokugawa shogunate were marked by economic strain, social unrest, and the unprecedented pressures of foreign intervention. By 1868, the accumulated weaknesses of hereditary military governance, combined with reformist ambitions among regional domains, culminated in a decisive political transformation, the Meiji Restoration. Central to this transition was the Boshin War, 1868 to 1869, a civil conflict that pitted pro-imperial forces against the remaining loyalists of the Tokugawa regime. The war was both a military and institutional contest, marking the end of centuries of samurai dominance in governance. The Boshin War began with a coalition of domains advocating the emperor's restoration, primarily Satsuma, Chashu, and Tosa. These domains had long cultivated reformist ideologies, modernized militaries, and strategic alliances, combining traditional samurai loyalty with pragmatic engagement with Western technology. Their forces utilized both conventional swordsmanship and modern rifles, artillery, and naval vessels, reflecting the accelerated adoption of Western military techniques that had begun in the Bakumatsu period. In contrast, Tokugawa loyalists largely relied on conventional samurai methods, though some had begun limited modernization. The resulting imbalance highlighted the incompatibility of traditional warrior practices with industrialized warfare. Major engagements, including the Battle of Toba Fushimi, January 1868, decisively favored the pro-imperial coalition. The conflict quickly spread, with imperial forces systematically capturing shogunal strongholds and neutralizing domainal resistance. The surrender of Edo Castle in May 1868 symbolized the collapse of Tokugawa central authority, marking the effective dismantling of the shogunate without widespread urban destruction. Contemporary reports and domain correspondence indicate that many samurai surrendered under conditions preserving their social dignity, illustrating both pragmatism and the ceremonial weight of feudal tradition. Following military victory, the new Meiji government implemented a series of structural reforms to consolidate imperial power. Central to these reforms was the abolition of the Han system, replacing autonomous domains with prefectures under direct imperial administration. This effectively stripped the samurai class of their traditional political and economic bases, dissolving the hierarchical ties that had defined feudal Japan. Government records from 1871 detail the redistribution of domain lands and the conversion of samurai stipends into government bonds, a measure designed to compensate retainers while eliminating the hereditary obligations that had sustained them. The transformation was rapid and comprehensive. Samurai, once the ruling elite, found themselves legally equal to commoners, their social privileges abolished. This included the loss of exclusive rights to bear swords in public, exemption from taxes, and preferential access to bureaucratic positions. The legal framework, codified through the Heian Chiken, abolition of domains and establishment of prefectures, formalized the transition from a hereditary, military-based hierarchy to a centralized, bureaucratic state. Archaeological evidence, such as confiscated swords and urban restructuring of former castle towns, confirms the practical implementation of these reforms. Despite the administrative clarity of these measures, the transition generated significant social tension. Many samurai faced financial uncertainty. Bonds provided as compensation often depreciated in value, while the opportunity to engage in commercial activity conflicted with ingrained cultural ideals. Former retainers struggled to find roles in a modernizing economy that valued capital, literacy, and industrial skill over hereditary rank and martial ability. Letters and diaries from the period reveal widespread anxiety and nostalgia, reflecting both the material and symbolic dislocation experienced by the warrior class. The fall of the shogunate was not merely an institutional reorganization. It represented a paradigm shift in authority. Governance shifted from personal loyalty and hierarchical bonds to bureaucratic expertise, national law, and technological competence. Samurai loyalty, once the foundation of Japanese political life, was no longer a functional instrument for the new state. The restoration of imperial rule thus created a dual dynamic. Political centralization achieved stability, but the cultural and economic relevance of the samurai was simultaneously eroded. Resistance to these changes persisted. While many samurai acquiesced, others actively opposed the new order, culminating in armed uprisings such as the Saga Rebellion, 1874, and ultimately the Satsuma Rebellion, 1877. These uprisings, though ultimately unsuccessful, underscore the persistence of warrior identity and ideology even after institutional authority had been removed. Primary sources, including petitions, battle reports, and memoirs, reveal that participants framed their opposition not merely in economic terms, but as a defense of honor, tradition, and the moral authority of the samurai class. The fall of the shogunate also accelerated military and technological modernization. The Meiji government prioritized the establishment of a conscripted national army, drawing on Western training, armaments, and organizational structures. In effect, the military functions formerly monopolized by the samurai were transferred to a professional, nationally accountable force, further eroding the rationale for hereditary warrior privilege. Contemporary decrees mandated compulsory service and eliminated domain-based recruitment, creating a uniform military structure aligned with industrialized warfare standards. In retrospect, the collapse of Tokugawa rule and the abolition of the samurai reflect both internal systemic failure and external pressures. Economic stagnation, bureaucratic rigidity, and urbanization had already weakened the class, while foreign encroachment and ideological reform accelerated the decline. The emperor's restoration functioned as both a symbolic and practical reset, legitimizing central authority while eliminating the intermediary structures of feudal Japan. Samurai, once essential to governance and social order, were transformed into citizens of a modern state, their legal privileges abolished and their martial function largely obsolete. But their spirit resisted extinction. The samurai died not in defeat, but in transition. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 represents the final, organized expression of samurai resistance against the Meiji state. Rooted in both political and cultural grievances, the uprising was led by Seigo Takamori, a former samurai, statesman, and military leader who had initially supported the Meiji Restoration. Seigo's disillusionment with the rapid westernization and bureaucratic centralization of the new government crystallized the tensions between traditional warrior values and the imperatives of a modern nation-state. The rebellion was both a military and symbolic confrontation. Samurai identity, long defined by hereditary service, martial discipline, and loyalty to local domains, faced extinction under a conscripted army modeled on European lines. The immediate causes of the rebellion included the abolition of samurai stipends, the end of preferential status, and discontent over the forced surrender of traditional privileges. Many Satsuma samurai found themselves financially and socially marginalized, unable to compete with merchant wealth or adapt to the bureaucratic requirements of the Meiji state. Additionally, the government's conscription law, introduced in 1873, threatened the military monopoly historically held by the samurai class. These factors coalesced in Satsuma, a domain with a proud warrior tradition and a history of political activism, producing a powerful regional coalition willing to challenge the new order. Seigo Takamori emerged as the central figure of resistance. A veteran of the Boshin War and former government official, he initially advocated compromise but ultimately sided with dissatisfied samurai when the government rejected their demands for recognition, retention of stipends, and the preservation of certain military privileges. Seigo's leadership exemplified the continuity of samurai ideology even in the context of profound systemic change. Loyalty to comrades, honor, and moral authority guided his strategic decisions as he mobilized approximately 20,000 men, many armed with traditional swords and rifles acquired through local arsenals. The rebellion began with the capture of Kagoshima, the Satsuma provincial capital, and rapidly escalated into pitched battles against Meiji forces. The government, anticipating the challenge, deployed a modern conscripted army, equipped with Western firearms, artillery, and logistical support. In contrast, Seigo's forces combined conventional swordsmanship with limited rifle units, demonstrating the hybrid nature of samurai combat in the late 19th century. Contemporary reports describe disciplined formations, strategic use of terrain, and the symbolic display of banners and standards, reflecting the persistence of ritual and hierarchical organization even in the face of modern warfare. The rebellion included several notable engagements, including the Battle of Tabarazaka and the protracted siege of Kumamoto Castle. In these encounters, samurai forces initially leveraged superior knowledge of local terrain and morale, but were ultimately outmatched by artillery bombardment, massed infantry, and coordinated logistics of the Meiji army. Accounts from surviving soldiers and official dispatches illustrate the contrast between samurai valor and modern military efficiency. Traditional courage and individual heroism could not compensate for the organizational and technological advantages of a centralized army. Economically, the rebellion highlighted the fragility of a class reliant on hereditary stipends and local networks. The Meiji government's mobilization was financed through national taxation and credit systems, whereas Seigo's forces relied on personal savings, domainal bonds, and voluntary contributions. This imbalance reflects a broader transformation. Warfare had shifted from a personal, feudal enterprise to a state-managed, industrialized operation. The failure of the samurai to secure logistical parity underscores the structural limitations imposed by modernity, even on disciplined and ideologically committed warriors. The ideological dimension of the rebellion was equally significant. Samurai participants framed their struggle as a defense of honor, duty, and moral authority, positioning themselves as guardians of traditional Japanese values against what they perceived as excessive westernization and bureaucratic despotism. Pamphlets, memorials, and posthumous accounts emphasized themes of loyalty to comrades, courage in battle, and adherence to Bushido principles. Historians note that this framing transformed the conflict into a symbolic narrative of cultural continuity, rather than merely a military contest. The final confrontation occurred at Shiroyama, where Seigo and his remaining 4,000 samurai made their last stand against a vastly superior Meiji force. Outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, they fought with disciplined courage but were ultimately annihilated. Seigo reportedly committed seppuku in accordance with samurai ritual, and the surviving forces surrendered or were killed. The battle has since been interpreted as the end of the samurai as an active military class, marking the conclusion of a social and martial era that had lasted over 7 centuries. Yet the Satsuma Rebellion was not merely a defeat. It represented a transition of samurai identity. While the military function of the samurai ceased, the ideological and symbolic dimensions persisted. Literature, theater, and visual arts of the late 19th century began to commemorate the rebellion, elevating figures like Seigo Takamori to national iconography. His image, often idealized, represented loyalty, courage, and moral integrity, qualities that transcended the practical obsolescence of the warrior class. Contemporary newspapers, official government commemorations, and later textbooks contributed to embedding this narrative in the emerging national consciousness. The rebellion also influenced the modernization trajectory of the Meiji state. Lessons learned regarding mobilization, logistics, and combat readiness informed the development of a national conscript army, directly shaping Japan's military institutions in the 1880s and beyond. Furthermore, the ideological appropriation of samurai values into national identity facilitated the construction of a moral framework for citizens, linking the virtues of courage, loyalty, and discipline to civic duty rather than hereditary privilege. In this way, the samurai's spiritual and cultural legacy outlasted their political and military authority. In summary, the Satsuma Rebellion demonstrates the complex interplay of tradition and modernity in late 19th century Japan. Samurai participants fought to preserve their social and martial order, but were confronted by technological, organizational, and economic realities that made their resistance unsustainable. Their defeat signaled the formal end of the samurai as a class, yet the symbolic and ideological dimensions of their identity were absorbed into a new national narrative, shaping modern Japan's conception of honor, loyalty, and duty. From warriors to national icons, their evolution was not over. The sword that once served lords now served the nation. Following the formal abolition of the samurai class in 1877, the Meiji state faced the dual challenge of nation-building and cultural legitimation. The military and administrative functions of the samurai were no longer necessary, yet the ideological framework of loyalty, honor, and discipline retained social resonance. The government responded by recasting samurai ethics as a national ideology, integrating elements of Bushido into educational, military, and civic instruction to serve the emerging modern state. This process involved both selective historical reinterpretation and ideological construction, creating a mythic narrative that linked pre-modern martial values to contemporary national objectives. Central to this reinvention was the promotion of loyalty to the emperor. Whereas samurai had historically served individual lords or regional domains, the Meiji government emphasized that allegiance should be transferred to the emperor as the embodiment of the nation. Educational reforms, including the Imperial Rescript on Education, 1890, codified virtues such as filial piety, courage, and duty, drawing directly from historical samurai ideals. Textbooks and moral instruction depicted samurai as exemplars of devotion and discipline, providing a historical precedent for the ethical conduct expected of all Japanese citizens. In this way, The ethos of the warrior was transformed from feudal service to civic virtue, supporting centralization and modernization simultaneously. Military reforms further institutionalized this reinterpretation. The creation of a conscription army in 1873 adopted some organizational principles reminiscent of samurai structures. Emphasis on unit cohesion, discipline, and leadership development. Although the army's weaponry and training were fully modern, ideological frameworks continued to invoke the samurai spirit. Officers were trained to valorize loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice, linking personal conduct to national service. In doing so, the Meiji state appropriated symbolic authority formerly held by samurai families, using historical narratives to legitimize a modern military institution. Cultural production reinforced the mythic narrative. Literature, theater, and visual arts frequently depicted samurai as moral paragons, emphasizing loyalty, bravery, and honor. Historical figures such as Seigo Takamori were memorialized not as failed rebels but as moral exemplars whose ethics could guide modern citizens. This reinterpretation selectively emphasized samurai values compatible with state objectives, while downplaying elements inconsistent with industrial modernization, such as domainal loyalty or hereditary privilege. Museums, monuments, and ceremonial observances further embedded these representations into the public consciousness, creating a shared national memory of the samurai that served ideological purposes. The Meiji government also leveraged Shinto and the imperial cult to reinforce the connection between samurai values and the nation. Rituals, shrines, and state ceremonies celebrated martial virtue as an expression of loyalty to the emperor and the state. This integration was not simply symbolic. It provided a moral rationale for conscription, obedience, and sacrifice, aligning historical memory with contemporary governance. By linking samurai ethics to the emperor's authority, the government effectively nationalized a formerly regional and class-specific ideology, transforming it into a tool of statecraft. Educational institutions played a particularly important role in institutionalizing the new narrative. Moral instruction emphasized the historical continuity of samurai ethics, presenting students with exemplars of discipline, filial piety, and courage drawn from feudal chronicles. Historical study was subordinated to ideological function. Events and figures were selectively interpreted to highlight qualities deemed essential for modern citizenship. This selective historiography reinforced the mythic dimension of Bushido, presenting it as timeless, universal, and intrinsically Japanese, rather than a contingent product of social and economic structures. By the late 19th century, the samurai ethos had transcended its original social and military context. Its incorporation into state ideology helped legitimize modernization, foster loyalty, and encourage discipline among citizens and soldiers alike. While the samurai no longer existed as a distinct class, their symbolic authority persisted in shaping civic behavior, military conduct, and cultural norms. The moral vocabulary of Bushido, honor, loyalty, courage, duty, became central to narratives of national identity, linking Japan's feudal past with its industrialized present. Internationally, the reinterpretation of samurai ethics influenced the perception of Japan abroad. Diplomatic accounts, travel writings, and military observers often highlighted the disciplined and loyal nature of Japanese soldiers, attributing these qualities to the historical legacy of the samurai. This exported image reinforced Japan's national prestige and contributed to a form of soft power in international relations, demonstrating how mythic representations of historical elites can extend their influence beyond their original society. In conclusion, the Meiji state's construction of a samurai-based national ideology illustrates the power of historical reinterpretation. Formerly functional and localized social practices were transformed into enduring moral principles, serving the needs of state formation, military modernization, and cultural identity. The sword that once served feudal lords now symbolically served the nation, ensuring that the samurai's ethical legacy survived even after their formal extinction. This myth would cross oceans and centuries. The West remade the samurai into a mirror of its own ideals. In the decades following Japan's opening to the world, Western observers became increasingly captivated by the figure of the samurai. While the samurai had ceased to exist as a functioning social class, Western writers, diplomats, and scholars reinterpreted their history through lenses of romance, martial valor, and moral idealism. This fascination was not purely historical. It reflected Western desires to project familiar narratives of chivalry, honor, and heroic struggle onto a society that was simultaneously exotic and modernizing. The result was a mythologized image of the samurai that often diverged sharply from historical reality. A pivotal moment in the global dissemination of samurai ideals came with Naitobe Inatsuo's 1900 publication, Bushido, the Soul of Japan. Naitobe, a Japanese scholar educated in the West, sought to explain Japanese culture to European and American audiences. He portrayed Bushido as a coherent moral code, emphasizing loyalty, honor, courage, and self-discipline. In his account, the samurai appeared as a disciplined, ethical warrior class whose values could serve as a universal model for moral conduct. While influential internationally, Naitobe's text selectively interpreted historical practices, downplaying economic, political, and social contingencies to present a streamlined, ideological narrative compatible with Western moral sensibilities. Western media of the early 20th century reinforced this mythic image. Travelogues, novels, and later films portrayed samurai as stoic, invincible warriors, emphasizing swordsmanship, ritualized duels, and unwavering loyalty. Historians note that these portrayals often reflected Western concepts of knighthood and heroism, rather than the complex realities of feudal Japanese society. Samurai were depicted as paragons of virtue, often devoid of the political compromises, internal factionalism, and social hierarchies that had characterized their historical existence. This romanticization contributed to a perception of Japan as a land of disciplined martial virtue, bridging cultural fascination with ideological projection. The global myth of the samurai intensified during periods of military conflict. Early 20th century observers and propagandists highlighted the discipline and morale of Japanese soldiers as deriving from samurai heritage, linking contemporary military effectiveness to historical precedent. Literature and journalism emphasized moral and psychological qualities, reinforcing the notion that Bushido was both ancient and timeless. However, as scholars have emphasized, these accounts often conflated symbolic ideals with practical historical behaviors, creating a hybrid construct that blended myth, nationalism, and martial romanticism. Cinematic portrayals further solidified the samurai myth internationally. Beginning in the 1950s with Japanese cinema, and later through Western adaptations, the samurai became a recognizable archetype, stoic, disciplined, and morally principled. Directors such as Akira Kurosawa presented samurai not only as historical actors, but as ethical and psychological symbols. These films emphasized personal honor, loyalty, and strategic mastery, projecting historical narratives into universally resonant moral dramas. International audiences adopted these portrayals, often without awareness of their historical specificity, reinforcing the samurai's global symbolic status. This global fascination had reciprocal effects on Japanese society itself. International acclaim for samurai literature and media reinforced domestic narratives of martial heritage, contributing to the nationalization of Bushido and its incorporation into education and civic ideology. While historically contingent, the samurai ethos was reframed as timeless moral guidance, influencing everything from military instruction to popular culture. In this sense, Western reinterpretation and Japanese state ideology mutually reinforced the samurai's symbolic longevity, ensuring that the memory of the warrior class transcended its historical end. Despite these mythologizations, traces of historical reality persist beneath the narrative. Archival documents, letters, and military manuals reveal the complex social, economic, and political dimensions of the samurai class. They were not purely moral paragons. They navigated fiscal pressures, domainal politics, and the evolving requirements of warfare. The Western and popular myths, while culturally influential, often obscure these practical and contingent aspects of samurai life, highlighting the tension between symbolic memory and historical fact. In conclusion, the Western fascination with the samurai demonstrates the power of selective interpretation in shaping global cultural memory. Samurai ideals were reconstructed to resonate with foreign moral frameworks, cinematic aesthetics, and popular imagination, producing a transnational myth that both celebrated and simplified historical reality. Yet the persistence of archival evidence, legal records, and material culture provides a foundation for nuanced understanding, reminding scholars and audiences that beneath myth and memory, traces of reality remain. Yet beneath myth and memory, traces of reality remain. Discipline outlived the sword. In the decades following World War II, Japan experienced profound social, economic, and political transformation. The country's rapid industrialization and reconstruction necessitated new forms of social cohesion and ethical frameworks. Within this context, the samurai ethos, long formalized through Bushido, was reinterpreted as a model for civic and corporate conduct. Though the samurai had ceased to exist as a legal or military class in the 19th century, their historical reputation for discipline, loyalty, and moral rigor provided a symbolic template for a modern society navigating the complexities of post-war reconstruction. Corporate culture became a primary domain for the samurai legacy. Japan's burgeoning industrial and manufacturing sectors relied on strict hierarchies, loyalty to employers, and group cohesion, concepts resonant with the traditional values of samurai service. Historical analysis indicates that management philosophies often drew on Bushido-inspired principles, emphasizing diligence, commitment, and ethical responsibility, particularly among salaried employees who were expected to prioritize company loyalty above individual interests. This alignment was not literal. Few organizations directly implemented samurai practices, but the symbolic association reinforced behavioral norms compatible with modern economic objectives. Education also reflected the enduring influence of samurai ethics. Moral education, standardized curricula, and civic instruction emphasized responsibility, respect for authority, and perseverance. These pedagogical approaches drew selectively on the historical memory of samurai virtue, portraying discipline, courage, and loyalty as foundational cultural values rather than historical prescriptions for warrior conduct. Studies of mid-20th century textbooks demonstrate that narratives often highlighted famous samurai figures as exemplars of moral integrity, using historical biography to instill ethical principles relevant to students' contemporary lives. Ethically, the samurai ethos provided a framework for social behavior and national identity in a society facing rapid modernization. The moral vocabulary of Bushido honor, duty, courage, and loyalty was adapted to non-military contexts, guiding interactions within families, workplaces, and civic institutions. Sociological analyses suggest that this adaptation facilitated a sense of continuity and cultural stability, linking Japan's historical past with the ethical imperatives of a modern industrial nation. Even as legal, economic, and social structures changed, the symbolic authority of samurai ideals endured, shaping public expectations of conduct and professionalism. Historians note that post-war reinterpretation of the samurai ethos also functioned as a counterbalance to Western influence. Japan's occupation and exposure to foreign cultural, legal, and educational systems challenged traditional social norms. By emphasizing values derived from samurai memory, policymakers, educators, and corporate leaders created a moral framework rooted in Japanese historical identity. This framework provided continuity amid social transformation, linking collective discipline and loyalty to cultural heritage while accommodating the demands of industrialized, democratic society. In parallel, popular culture reinforced the post-war adaptation of samurai ethics. Films, literature, and television frequently portrayed historical samurai as paragons of virtue, emphasizing personal discipline, strategic thinking, and moral decision-making. While these portrayals often romanticized the past, they also reinforced social ideals relevant to contemporary audiences, bridging the gap between historical fact and modern utility. Cultural memory, in this context, functioned as both a repository of national identity and a tool for ethical instruction, integrating historical narrative into everyday life. The reinterpretation of samurai values in post-war Japan was not uniform or uncontested. Scholars and social critics emphasized that many idealized traits, unquestioning loyalty, hierarchical obedience, and martial valor, required careful adaptation to modern, democratic contexts. Nonetheless, the symbolic authority of the samurai provided a culturally resonant foundation for ethical behavior, linking historical memory with practical societal application. Corporate manuals, educational texts, and civic instruction frequently reference these qualities, demonstrating the persistence of samurai-derived moral principles even in non-military spheres. The post-war period also saw the integration of samurai ethics into organizational and institutional identity. Military academies, law enforcement, and public service programs occasionally drew on Bushido-inspired frameworks to instill discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty. Though the historical realities of feudal service were absent, the symbolic and ethical dimensions of the samurai provided a model for professional conduct and institutional cohesion. This demonstrates the enduring adaptability of samurai ideals, capable of informing behavior in a variety of modern contexts. In summary, post-war Japan illustrates the philosophical and cultural continuity of samurai values, despite the disappearance of the class itself. Discipline, loyalty, courage, and ethical rigor, once the hallmarks of a hereditary warrior elite, were reframed to serve the needs of industrial, educational, and civic institutions. The sword had disappeared, but the principles it symbolized continued to shape social norms, professional ethics, and collective identity. In this transformation, the samurai's historical function shifted from martial and political authority to symbolic and moral guidance, bridging centuries of change while retaining cultural relevance. From warriors to workers, an ancient code adapted. What archaeology reveals is far more human than myth. While literature, media, and national ideology have shaped the samurai's enduring image, archaeological research and critical scholarship provide a grounded view of the warrior class, emphasizing the practical, social, and material realities of their lives. Excavations of castles, battlefields, and domestic sites, along with the analysis of surviving artifacts, illuminate aspects of samurai existence often obscured by myth, economic constraints, household structures, gender roles, and the daily routines of warriors. These findings challenge popular assumptions of uniform nobility, heroic valor, and rigid adherence to Bushido. Excavations at castle towns such as Himeji, Edo, and Kagoshima reveal the scale and complexity of samurai residences, which combined administrative offices, barracks, and domestic spaces. Archaeologists have documented storage facilities for rice and weapons, evidence of economic management, and variations in housing quality that corresponded to rank and stipend. These material remains demonstrate that samurai life was structured around both martial readiness and bureaucratic function, with day-to-day activities encompassing paperwork, estate oversight, and logistical management as much as swordsmanship. The archaeological record underscores that the romanticized image of samurai constantly engaged in duels or campaigns reflects only a small part of their lived experience. Artifacts such as armor, swords, and firearms offer further insight into technological adaptation and social signaling. Metallurgical studies of swords reveal regional production techniques and innovations, while decorative elements often indicate status or domain affiliation rather than universal aesthetic preferences. Surviving firearms and matchlock guns confirm that from the 16th century onward, samurai incorporated modern weapons alongside traditional arms, challenging notions that they were rigidly conservative in martial practice. Similarly, protective armor shows functional evolution to accommodate firearms and mobility, reflecting a pragmatic approach to warfare rather than purely ceremonial use. Archaeological surveys of battlefields, including Genpei War sites and Sengoku period fortifications, provide evidence of logistical strategies, fortification design, and troop movement. Post-battle stratigraphy often reveals temporary encampments, discarded equipment, and fortification repair patterns, indicating that samurai military activity was carefully organized and responsive to tactical realities. These findings suggest that battlefield behavior emphasized coordination, supply management, and strategic positioning, elements frequently overlooked in literary or cinematic depictions of the samurai as solely heroic duelists. Material culture also illuminates the economic realities of samurai households. Excavated rice granaries, coin caches, and household utensils indicate that many samurai lived with fluctuating resources, reliant on stipends that could be irregular or devalued. Archaeologists have documented evidence of debt, bartering, and adaptive resource use, reflecting a class not uniformly affluent or insulated. This material evidence corroborates historical accounts of economic strain during the late Tokugawa period, when stipends often failed to meet the costs of lifestyle, military readiness, and social obligations. Gender dynamics within samurai households are similarly clarified through archaeology and textual analysis. Examination of domestic spaces and family records shows that women played active roles in estate management, household defense, and social negotiation. Samurai wives frequently oversaw finances, supervised retainers, and, in some cases, participated in defensive actions during sieges. Household shrines and personal artifacts indicate that religious and moral instruction was integral to domestic life, with women responsible for transmitting ethical and ritual knowledge. These findings counter the perception of samurai households as male-dominated spheres of martial activity, highlighting the central role of women in sustaining social and economic structures. Revisionist scholarship further challenges the conventional mythos of Bushido as an ancient, rigid code. Historical and archaeological studies demonstrate that samurai conduct varied regionally, temporally, and socially. Codes of behavior were context-specific and adaptive, responding to local politics, economic constraints, and military technology. Textual sources, including domain records, letters, and legal documents, reveal that ideals such as loyalty, honor, and courage were often mediated by practical considerations, negotiations, and political expediency. Consequently, the moralized, universalized Bushido popularized in modern media and education represents a selective reconstruction rather than historical uniformity. Material culture also reflects this adaptability. For example, ceramic and household artifacts excavated from samurai dwellings indicate a combination of practical domestic life with elite consumption patterns, suggesting that samurai straddled multiple social roles: warriors, administrators, and participants in urban or rural economies. The juxtaposition of functional military equipment with decorative domestic items highlights the hybrid social identity of the class, balancing martial obligations with bureaucratic, economic, and familial responsibilities. Historical reassessment further complicates narratives of samurai homogeneity. Regional variation, domain-specific practices, and rank disparities produced a pluralistic social structure, where the experiences of low-ranking retainers differed markedly from those of high-ranking daimyo. Archaeological evidence of smaller, less fortified residences, limited access to luxury goods, and communal workspaces suggests that many samurai experienced material and social constraints more akin to middle-class households than elite warriors. These findings remind scholars that the samurai were not a monolithic class, but a socially and economically stratified group with diverse experiences. Studies of epigraphic and textual evidence, such as memorial inscriptions, family records, and estate documents, provide additional nuance. Inscriptions on gravestones, for example, often memorialize familial duty and social roles rather than martial exploits, indicating that identity and honor were deeply rooted in social and familial obligations. Legal documents clarify property rights, inheritance patterns, and dispute resolution, revealing the bureaucratic and judicial dimensions of samurai life. Collectively, these records show that the samurai's societal influence extended beyond the battlefield, encompassing economic, legal, and cultural authority. Archaeology also revises our understanding of samurai participation in technological and commercial activity. Trade records, armament production sites, and port excavations illustrate engagement with domestic and foreign economies, demonstrating that samurai were often enmeshed in the production and circulation of goods. This challenges the notion of the samurai as isolated martial elites and underscores their integration into broader societal networks, combining military, administrative, and economic functions. Finally, The combined evidence of archaeology and revisionist scholarship emphasizes the humanity and contingency of samurai life. They were not mythic paragons or timeless moral exemplars. They were actors responding to political, economic, and social constraints. The material record, swords worn, armor repaired, household goods arranged, reveals daily choices, compromises, and adaptations that shaped lived experience. This approach allows historians to distinguish between the symbolic, ideological samurai perpetuated in popular imagination and the historical realities of a complex social class. In conclusion, archaeological evidence and historical reassessment provide a balanced, empirically grounded understanding of the samurai. Excavated fortifications, domestic artifacts, weapons, and epigraphic records reveal the practical realities of social hierarchy, economic management, military adaptation, and gender roles. Revisionist scholarship corrects misconceptions propagated by ideology, literature, and media, emphasizing the plurality, adaptability, and human dimensions of samurai life. Together, these insights allow historians and audiences to appreciate the class not merely as an idealized symbol, but as a historically contingent, socially embedded institution. Thus ends the journey of Japan's warrior class, from province to memory. If you found this journey through the history of the samurai insightful, consider subscribing to Nightfall History for more academically grounded, cinematic explorations of civilizations and empires from around the world. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our feature-length documentaries, and leave a comment sharing which era or figure you'd like us to explore next. For the full immersive experience, we recommend watching with headphones and following along with timestamps provided in the description.